We are live. Joining me today, as usual, a very special guest, Peter Langland-Hassan. Peter, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do for those who might not know you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, Richard. This is fantastic. I've been looking forward to this. So I'm a professor of philosophy at University of Cincinnati. I've been here about 12 years or so. I work in the philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology, philosophy of cognitive science. Topics I work on are things like imagination, inner speech, memory. Though I'm also interested in consciousness and introspection and those things, and those topics kind of oddly led me into these other more specific things like imagination and inner speech that I've worked a lot on. I was a postdoc in the PNP program at WashU before this job, and then before that, I was a grad student at the CUNY Graduate Center with our host Richard Brown. So a lot of good memories from that, and I'm really enjoying catching up with him now because of that.
Awesome. So that's right. Back at the old graduate center, what year did you show up there?
I think 2003.
So the same year that I did. I didn't realize we
Yeah,
came in the same class.
yeah, we did. Yeah, I remember you walking in with your big headphones and
Yeah.
like, who's this guy? And we got
Yeah, yeah. Not that it's here or there, but I remember one day I was in class and Peter Simpson was sitting next to me, and I had my headphones on, and he was like, "I can hear your awful music," and I was like, "You're welcome, bro. It's just Snoop
totally.
Dogg, actually."
Yeah. No, we were in a lot of the same, session, and then the CogSci symposium that David Rosenthal, ran.
Absolutely.
That was a big part of, I think, both of our experience there.
Yeah, I would say so. So that's very cool. And then so I forgot that you did the postdoc at Wash U. How was it being there? Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, I enjoyed my time. I mean, it was a great place. Got to work with some great people there. Um, and it was a harrowing time, though. Like I had a young son. Our second son was born while we were there, and it's
Oh,
like a
wow.
2 year limit thing, and you don't know what's going to happen. So probably also the most stressful time of my life. But it's a beautiful place to be and to work, and a lot of brilliant people there. So I
Yeah,
enjoyed
I've always
the
wanted
fun
to go
there.
to visit over there, but I've never quite made it. So that's very cool.
Yeah, yeah, no, you should.
And then how long have you been at the University of Cincinnati?
Got here 2011, so I
Oh,
guess
wow.
it's yeah. We're coming up on a full 13 years.
Wow,
I guess
awesome. Yeah.
yeah.
And University of
Yeah, well,
Cincinnati got some great people, including yourself. So I'm really cool that you got that job landed there.
oh, thanks. Yeah, well, we got a good stable of people working in Cog Sci, Phil Mind. So Tom Folger's here, Tony Chimera, who I think you had on at one point,
Yeah.
Heidi Maybaum, and then we just hired some new folks working in AI and things, Andre Curtis Trudell. So yeah, it's nice. We're kind of like focused. We got a kind of a deep Phil Sci, Phil Mind focus, and then so we're a little specialized in that way. But we're trying to fill in I hear there's like a history of philosophy as well that is relevant. So we're trying to do some more hiring in that area. But it's
Oh,
nice to
good.
have some colleagues who work on similar things. Yeah.
Awesome. So it's a good place for graduate students interested in that kind of philosophy of mind, cog sci to check out, even though for some unknown reason it's not mentioned in the who rankings, which is sort of a travesty in my
Yeah,
opinion.
exactly. Yeah, I won't ramble on about that. I was director of graduate studies for a number of years before that, so I've got a whole spiel.
Okay.
Yeah, we do great in those areas. In fact, and we've done great at placing grad students. I think there's this other independent report. It's like what's the academic? I can never quite remember the acronym, but ADPA. I don't know.
Is that the
Anyway,
Carolyn Dicey
like
Jennings one?
yeah, exactly that
Yeah.
one. And we're something like third in the world in like placing people in permanent positions.
Awesome.
Some tenure track, but a lot of other just like permanent jobs in philosophy. So we do find people jobs, and
Yeah. I mean, the lighter rankings are good, but they really, as you're saying, they highlight reputational status of the faculty, which is not the same as ability to get students jobs or to mentor the students that they have there. So
Right, right.
just for what
Yeah,
it's worth, those are different qualities. Sometimes they overlap, but it's not always the case.
agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Cool. Well,
Yeah.
so that's awesome. I mean, I wanted to just recommend your book to anyone who's watching this later. Your book, Explaining Imagination, came out in 2020. I've read it. I've read through it, well, twice actually now, but it's just so clearly written. It's just, very thorough, very engaging, very scholarly, if one might say. You've covered like all your bases, I would say. So I just think that this is like a really great book, and I hope that it's attracting attention. I know it's already been 4 years since it came out, but as we were talking, these things move slowly. So I do hope it attracts, changes the conversation a bit. I also found myself largely agreeing with your conclusions. So I was like, found it to be very sensible in that way as well. Not that that matters or anything, but just so you know,
Oh, thanks.
yeah. And it
No,
was surprising that the position that we're going to talk about wasn't already kind of a well-entrenched position. So that was one of the most surprising things to me.
oh, I'm glad you find that surprising because most people who can, for whatever reason, people drawn to imagination find the kind of view I propose to be just utterly, unthinkable. But there's like that's interesting. You can kind of make a case for that, and I'm like, kind of make a case
Kind of
for
make
it.
a case for that. So they just can't imagine it. I don't know. Just
Yeah, yeah.
okay. So, and of
Well,
course, you've done a lot of other work, as you were saying. So I might want to, if we have time, touch on some of that stuff as well.
sure.
But I wanted to start out asking you about the imagination. You mentioned that you got into imagination sort of through a circuitous route. So how did you become interested in imagination? What sucked you in?
It was Nagel's footnote 11.
The infamous footnote
There's
11. Stoljar has a whole paper on that footnote.
Yeah, there's a whole mini literature about the footnote. So this is a footnote to the What Is It Like to Be a Bat paper, where he's interested in, if there is this sort of some sort of necessary identity between, conscious mental states and brain states, why it would seem to be contingent,
Mhm.
and as it does to many. And he throws out this idea. Well, what may be going on here is we're imagining the one and the same thing in two different ways. We're using when we think about, when we imagine what it's like to be in a state, we're imagining a state sympathetically,
Mhm.
and to imagine something sympathetically is to put yourself in a state that's similar to the state uh, itself that you're thinking about, similar to the state you would be in. No, if you were, let's see, to imagine sympathetically, you put yourself in a state. Yeah, I guess it is, as he put it, similar to the state itself,
Right.
as if you were in the state, I guess. And then, but if you imagine something perceptually, as we do sort of imagining it from the outside, or imagining looking at, say, the brain state or whatever that is supposedly identical to, this is different because we put ourselves in a state similar to the one we would be in if we perceived the state.
Mhm.
And so it's like, you're imagining one and the same thing in these two different ways. And because I guess one way you think of it, these disparate images, like you might use to imagine one and the same thing. So like if I imagine sort of literally looking at the brain state, I might form an image of some squishy brain, stuff, like, okay. The brain scientists and neurosurgeons looking at as they operate on you or something. Whereas if I imagine, that very same state, but being sympathetically, I put myself in a state that similar to the one I would be in if I was in that, which suppose when I'm in that state, I'm, seeing a beautiful sunset. Well, then I'm just gonna, when I imagine it that way, I'm gonna use an image of a beautiful sunset to think about it. And then I got these two very different images, one of a sunset and one of squishy brain stuff. I don't see how they fit together. But this is really just an artifact of how we're imagining things,
Mhm.
you know. And so it's just a very, it's a gesture, you gestures at that. It's like maybe that's something like that's going on. But there's all kinds of questions, and it's sort of a suggestive thing, and a number of people found that an interesting proposal, and it's been developed in different ways. We don't have to dive fully into my thoughts on that. I've thought a lot about that. In fact, that stuff didn't even make it into my book.
Yeah.
Uh, because but that kind of sucked me into it. So I was always interested in this mind body problem stuff and why there appears to be this deep puzzle there, and different attempts to explain it away, and there are many different attempts still on the market. but that was one of them, and that got me into imagination. And from there, I just kind of got pulled into other sort of surrounding phenomena. And before I knew it, I was like this guy who works on imagination.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I want to come back to some of that stuff about the mind-body problem maybe later on. But
Yeah,
I
sure.
guess so. I mean, that's funny. The power of one footnote. That footnote has had
Yeah,
a lot of influence on the literature. So never, don't throw away those footnotes, guys. You never know.
right, that's right. They just might spawn a literature. Yeah,
So what do you
yeah.
take imagination to be?
Well, the way I've come to approach it is I guess I wanted to try to ultimately these days I approach it kind of from the outside. Is that where I think about like, well, we describe people as imagining in all kinds of important scenarios. You know, how is this person able to pretend to be something he's not? Well, he's imagining that he's that. Or how is she able to reason to come to these, conclusions about what would happen in hypothetical scenarios? Well, she imagines a scenario. How are we able to enjoy fictions, without either thinking that it's really happening or and still reacting to them? And so, well, we're imagining what's going on, or um, how do people manage to be so creative and generating interesting artworks? And well, they use their imagination. So, starting with these kinds of phenomena, like I think of, okay, imagination is whatever it is that's enabling us to do these things. Um, these things that we do when we're inclined to describe someone as imagining. So it's kind of like trying to pin it down from the outside. Like, there's something there. If we wanted to make an artificial mind that was like a human mind, we'd need to give it this capacity, whatever it is, that's enabling people to pretend, to reason hypothetically, to enjoy artworks, to be creative. And I think that maybe to understand other minds, other perspectives, to empathize. These are all really important human things. If we want to, I'm always sort of thinking of things as a naturalistic philosopher of mind, like how would you mechanize this? How would you make something that can do this? So I think of imagination as like, well, what capacity, and we want to make something that can imagine. What do we need to be able to make it do? And it's those kinds
Mhm.
of things that we can point to. And then with that as a sort of starting point, I think, okay, well, what is the nature of this cognitive capacity such that it enables us to do these things? Um, and so if you're looking for like a really general slogan about what, I as a kind of like thing that unites, so I just listed a bunch of contexts where we imagine. If
Mhm.
you're looking like a general description, what unites all of those? What I suggest in the book is something like, you know, to imagine is to form rich, elaborated thoughts about the possible, unreal, fantastical, and so on in a way that's epistemically safe.
Mhm.
And by epistemically safe, I mean, and when you're doing that, it's the fact that you're doing that doesn't sort of call your sanity or rationality into question.
Yeah.
Unlike it might, like if you're in a bout of madness and you're having floored, delusional thoughts, and we don't necessarily call that imagining. You're out of, you're actually in a dangerous kind of situation, and you might be forming a lot of false beliefs and misperceptions, hallucinations. No, it's rich thought about the unreal, fantastical, and so on, but that doesn't call your sanity into question.
Mhm.
And that's just, and then we can try to get more and more specific. Um, but that's just the broadest way to gesture at it. And for some people, imagination has to involve mental imagery, right? There's the image in imagination, which, in the imagination literature, there's some debate about this, whether that has to be so. And then people want to divide up things and say, well, no, there's this imagination. It doesn't have to involve imagery. It can. The view I sort of suggest as a kind of starting point is like, well, this kind of broad ability to sort of think about possibilities in a rich and elaborated way. It doesn't have to involve imagery,
Mhm.
but it often does. So we'll want to be able to say something about the role of imagery in that. But um,
Yeah, and just as a little personal note, I found that very refreshing because as someone who like has aphantasia, I don't. I mean, I don't have visual imagery. I have auditory imagery and maybe dreams in imagistic ways, but I still think of myself as having a good imagination. I
yeah.
love to read books. I'm very good at pretend, or so my kids think. And so it was nice to read something that was defending the possibility of imagination in a non-imagistic way. Not to say that it never does involve images for those who are typical in this way, but at least it didn't exclude people like me right off the bat, which I sort of get the feeling that is the case in a lot of other definitions of imagination.
Yeah, it can happen. In which case you can always just move to the side like, well, then let's talk about supposition, all right?
Yeah.
And,
Well, that
and
is something I wanted to ask you. Is because
yeah.
you say this in several places in your book, but I never really got clear about like what, because you say they're closely related notions like supposition, conceivability,
Mhm.
and things like that. But what is the difference between these, on your view, and imagination? Like, what is it to suppose? Is it just a reason hypothetically, even though sometimes you do that imaginatively as well? So I'm just wondering, yeah, what is the difference in your view of these three things?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's something I realized, after the fact, like I should have been clearer about that. So I don't see a deep difference. I don't insist on any difference.
Okay.
Okay. I think these are sort of, terms we apply different. Some people want to mark out, for the people who want the distinction between an image evolving thing and a non-imagistic, it might be useful to say, well, by supposition, I sort of mean the non-image involving stuff, and imagination, I mean the image involving stuff.
Mhm.
But I don't think that's, yeah. But for me, I would want to equally give the same sort of answer about supposition and conceiving as I would about imagining.
Okay.
So I aim to just, um, I don't have, so yeah, I think non-imagistic imagining is the same as supposing or conceiving. Now
Okay.
there's people might, we can talk about like, well, isn't there a difference here? Can I suppose some things that I can't imagine? We could talk about that if you want.
It sounds like you
Um,
don't want to, though.
I don't want to ramble on
You're like, if
about
you're
that
gonna
if that's
force me
not,
to, I will. But
I just don't want to ramble on about it if I'm
this is
trying
the
to
place
think.
to ramble on, my friend. This is it.
Okay, fine. All right. Well, okay, so why does anyone ever want that distinction between supposing and conceive in imagining? Um, so I think the idea is supposed to be I can suppose just about anything. It's just a matter of like framing the thought or something,
Mhm.
like saying it to myself or whatever this is. I can suppose a contradiction, but I can't imagine a contradiction. Um, I don't, I don't feel the pull of that claim. I
Okay.
mean, I think there's interesting things to be said about what is it to imagine a contradiction or what is it to suppose a contradiction. Um, when those are put forward as in like I, what kind of claim is it if you say I can suppose this but I can't imagine it, or I can conceive this but I can't imagine it?
Right.
What grounds do you make that claim? The typical grounds have seem to be introspective, I guess.
Mhm.
Like, oh yeah, I can tell. I just supposed that. Oh, that wasn't imagining it. I know that if I did that, or no, I conceive it, And if that's all it is, it's like, well, I just don't think we have, I'm not some major skeptic about introspection, but at the same time, it's like our ability to make some sort of fine-grained distinction between, yeah, there's this psychological state I can tell I'm in that it's supposing, but it's not imagining. Like I don't find it particularly plausible that we're able to make that distinction, or that we
Mm.
even know enough about what we're talking about with imagination or supposition to be in a position to make that kind of introspective distinction.
Okay.
So if it's not through introspection that we know the difference between those states, I'm not sure what it is. I think if you want to point to a phenomenon, Okay, the best case for um maybe that I think there is for distinguishing imagining from supposing, but this is still sort of an introspective one, is there's the literature on imaginative resistance.
Yeah.
I talk
You
only a
talk
little
about
bit,
that. Yeah, exactly. A little bit.
yeah, a little bit, and some people really like to talk about that. The idea like you're reading a fiction, right? And the fiction says something kind of bizarre, like, Bill and Lisa were out for a drive. Someone is in the road and was in the way. They drove over them and killed them. It was right that they did so because it's never good to be in someone's way or something. And you're reading it, and typically you're reading along and you're saying, "Oh yeah, they were out for." I'm imagining this story, but you feel some resistance when the author says something, and it was right that they did so, like
Hmm.
you're stopped in some sense. Like, well, hold on, I was following along and imagining like that they're driving over and they kept going, but I don't continue. I've experienced resistance at imagining, at even just imagining that what they did was right or something.
Right.
But I can suppose that what they did was right.
Hmm.
So these are two different mental states. I don't know.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
do you
one
feel
thing
a pull there at all? Like,
well, I was thinking of it more in terms of the conceivability stuff, and I was specifically thinking of like Chalmers' conceivability distinction between negative and positive conceivability,
yeah.
where negative conceivability is put in terms of what I would call like rational coherence. So, is there a contradiction in the proposed thing? Whereas positive conceivability has something to do with being able to fill in the details about how the scenario would be in such a case, like to actually give an account of what would make it true or something like that. And I was wondering, well, so is merely like detecting, so taking some proposed scenario and asking, is there a contradiction in that scenario? Is that, would you consider that imaginative or using the imagination, or is that something that you would want to think of as distinct from that? Merely checking for coherence in that sense.
Um, I think it's all checking for coherence,
Okay.
and you can draw it out in more or less detail based on what you know. I think um, I sort of see, okay, this gets to something that again, probably um, I didn't this is an area I didn't focus on in the book, which from philosophy of mind is an important area, like to what extent imagination provides a warrant for beliefs about stuff like metaphysical possibilities and things like that.
Yeah.
I talk more about like everyday possibility, like was the couch going to fit through the door kind of stuff. Um, I think of imagining as more kind of like drawing inferences from what you already believe.
Hmm.
So not really in this terms of like I got into this state that now is providing evidence for beliefs that I wouldn't have had if I had to just rely on what I already knew.
Hmm.
Um, I think you can learn a lot of interesting things by drawing out consequences of what you believed, and there may be contradictions in what you already believe that you're surprised to discover at times, and so imagining you can learn things in that way. And I think a lot of thought experiments where you're trying to positively conceive of different things, or you conceive of, someone having true justified belief without having knowledge, you imagine a situation, and but what this involves is just kind of drawing out what ought to be true based on what you already think.
Hmm.
Um, and sometimes you infer new things on basis of that. So I don't know if this answers. So positive conceiving um, is, I guess I don't, these would be like a matter of degree between what, this sort of like negative, because it seems to make some sense. I can kind of think of, I don't see any problem with it. But now I go towards sort of filling it out more and thinking more how the world would be if that were the case. Yeah, it seems to be, it's making more and more sense, seems more and more plausible, it fits with what I already think. But I don't see like a deep difference in kind there that's going to provide, like one's going to provide much better warrant for a belief than another.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. But I don't want to. I was going to actually come back to this towards the end, so we haven't even really gotten to your account yet, which I want to make sure that we have time. So I'll maybe table some of this stuff and revisit this because I am interested in specifically what your account might serve as like a debunker for conceivability arguments, which just sort of sounds like what you were hinting at.
Yeah.
So I'm sympathetic to that. But
Okay.
before, I mean, I was just trying to ask some general questions about imagination before we get into the details. And the other
Sure.
kind of general question that I had was that right at the right at the beginning of your book, you kind of say, "Look, I can imagine myself, without a leg, without vision, but you can't really be you without imagination." That
Yeah.
there's something about the imagination that can't just be carved off like some other mental faculty. It's somehow inherently a part of your mind or my mind or something like that. And I was really struck. I thought that was really interesting way to frame things. Um, so in your mind, imagination then is something that's distinctively intertwined with all of our mental capacities. It's not a separate capacity. Is that the right way to put that point?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Um, and that fits with how I start that way because it kind of previews where I'm headed,
Hmm.
which is to say I developed this, I call it like a reductive account of imagination, where imagination isn't like this one faculty, like vision that, oh, you could lose it, and then you got the rest of the mind going. It's actually going to kind of splinter into a lot of different things. So what we're call imagining in one context is really just, using your beliefs in certain kinds of ways to like just using beliefs to arrive at sort of like a new belief in a conditional or something, or it might just be in another case having some current desires, like you're just kind of experiencing your desire for this to happen. We call it a desire in one case, but you could also call it he's imagining this, um, and but it's also deeply intertwined with just um, the ability to reason about different kinds of topics. In a lot of cases, um, like pretending, maybe here's an example, to focus on, it's important to kind of face this question. Intuitively, pretending requires imagining, right? It's very natural to think of like the cognitive component of pretend behavior is like, well, you're able to pretend because you're imagining. Um, Okay, well, what is this imagining? Suppose we couldn't use the word imagining. Could we describe what's going on mentally with you such that you're able to pretend? I say, well, sure. It's important that you not believe the thing is happening. There's some sort of connection to, I don't really believe this is going on, and spelling that out is it's a little tricky in some cases, but it can be done. And then you're thinking about how, if I'm pretending to be a lion, well, I need to know some things about lions. If I don't know anything about lions, I can't really pretend to be a lion. What do I need to do? Well, I need a desire. What's the desire that's relevant here? Well, to make it's not, I don't need to think. I said that we need to get away from the idea that I need to think I am a lion,
Yeah.
right? I don't need to think that, right? In fact, but that's what starts a lot of, theorizing. I got this representation. I'm a lion, and it needs to be sort of quarantined from the rest of my what I really believe in things and developed in certain ways because that's not something I think. You don't need to think you're a lion. You need to think, how do I make myself lion-like in some salient ways? What do lions do? Well, if I move my arm like this, if I make this kind of sound, then I can make myself lion-like. It's a simple example, but it's just to say, like, if you don't start with that idea that I need this thought, I am a lion, you can go in a different way with it and understand the psychology in to me, a much, simpler and more plausible way. if you think I'm a lion, there's all kinds of weird things that would occur to you that never occur to you when you're pretending. Like if I'm a lion, then I'm a really weird looking lion,
Yeah, exactly.
like, yeah,
A cowardly
like
lion, even.
just, yeah, like, I'm a lion with human parent, like, but none of that, I mean, none of that's actually going on psychologically. Like, let's just think about like, no, I know I'm not a lion, and that's an important part of what makes me pretending that I'm a lion. I just want to make myself sort of like a lion, and I've got the knowledge to do so. I don't, and I can just draw on my beliefs about lions to do so.
Right.
Now,
But is
might
it
might
really
not.
the case that you couldn't pretend without imagining? Is that your view?
Um, I guess I'm inclined to say that if you're pretending, you are imagining.
Uh,
So to read it the other way, which is to say, imagining just picks out the cognition that is enabling you to pretend. Like that's how the term sort of gets a foothold. So if we agree that, oh yeah, this is definitely pretense, then whatever the mental states are that you're in, those count as imagining. So
mhm.
if it's just a belief like, oh, a railroad engineer goes like this, and that's all that's driving my behavior. But it's clear that I'm pretending. I'm not just doing this for some other reason. I'm pretending. I was like, yeah, I'm pretending to be a railroad engineer. Um, I'm not going to turn around and say, well, now you're not really imagining it because you just have that one belief you're relying on.
Mhm.
Whereas I think some others would want to say that. It's like, oh, I think it's more common in the literature for people to say, oh, we allow, I mean, people are mixed on this, but many would say, we allow you could pretend without imagining. Um, but it's just we usually do imagine when we pretend. And I say, no, you're always imagining when you pretend because I'm inclined to treat those minimal cases that you would say was just belief. Those count too, because
Okay, I
there's
see.
not a deep difference.
And but I thought also on your view, there's some subtlety here because wait, maybe every case of pretending is a case of imagining, but can't. But I thought it was also your view that you could say what pretending was without invoking imagination. Or did I misunderstand that
Yeah,
part?
that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's right. So I don't define pretending in terms of imagining. I
Well,
guess
sounded like you kind of just did.
well, I said like if we agree that someone is pretending, then we should go ahead and say that they are imagining. That is enabling to do that. But then you can say, well, what is it to pretend then? And so my account of what it is to pretend is like this, like to pretend that X is Y is to intentionally make X Y-like while believing that X is not a Y and won't be made into a Y in the process.
Mhm.
That's an account of what it is to pretend that X is Y that doesn't involve um, it involves an intention to make X Y like. Yep. But it doesn't appeal to, and you use imagination or it just, um, does that make
Yeah,
sense?
but
So it,
I just so I'm wondering about what the exact relationship there is because does it entail that to make X Y like is to imagine, or is it that just as a matter of like happenstance of being human that that's the way we do it to make X Y like is by imagining?
okay, hold on. So to pretend, so this is like a conceptual analysis of what it is to pretend,
Right.
okay? Um, it's to intentionally make X Y like while believing that X is not a Y. And
Hmm.
then there's some fine print, okay? So there's a definition of pretense. Doesn't say anything about imagination,
Hmm.
right? And then there's a separate thing. Um, okay, so what cognitively, goes on in a person when they're pretending? Well, I gave that one account. At the most basic level, they need to be sort of intending to make X Y like without believing that X is a Y. And they need to do that. And you might say, well, how do they manage to do that? Um, and you could say, well, I don't know. That's just my analysis of a pretense. Or you could say, well, they do it. Let's see. So I think, I think I see your questions, but like, but they do it by imagining. And okay, and so and then your question is, but could some other species or some other being intentionally, so satisfy my criterion for pretending, but then
Right.
where we wouldn't say they do it by imagining.
Right.
Um,
Or is it going to turn out to sort of be part of what it means to intentionally make X, Y like that? It turns out that you have to do the thing you call imagining. That really maybe imagining is kind of mentioned in your definition. It just implicitly.
well, um,
And I don't mean
I mean,
this as an objection. I was just something that
yeah,
I was curious about. I'm not trying to.
yeah. So let me think about this. So like, I think I would move to so my inclination to say I would first move to belief.
Mhm.
Okay, because I see that throughout the book as the more basic notion. So you want to know what goes on cognitively with someone who's pretending, even I don't care if you're human or non-human, I'm going to say you need to have some beliefs about what if you're trying to make something X like Y, like a piece of paper like an airplane, right? You need to have some beliefs about what airplanes are like
Mhm.
and an intention to make the paper like an airplane. Okay. And then you also need to believe that the paper is not an airplane. Okay.
That would help.
That
Yes.
yeah. So I'm with you to the point of like um any being, right, who's able to pretend's got to have some beliefs of this structure and some intention to make X, Y, like. Now, it's part of my theory. Well, any being that acts on those kinds of beliefs and intentions is pretending. So now I guess I'm at the point, like, yeah, any being who we're saying is pretending, we need to be prepared to ascribe to it relevant beliefs and intentions on the basis of which it's also true that they count as imagining on my
Right.
view.
Right.
So now, did I define pretense in terms of imagination? I don't think so because only because I gave a reductive account of imagination in that account. Like I give an account. It's if I had nothing to say about imagination, then I guess I would be defining pretense in terms of imagination. But then I'm defining imagination in terms of the beliefs and intentions of a certain sort.
Mhm.
So I don't think, even though I am committed, as you say, like, yeah, whatever being counts as pretending is imagining, I'm still not, there's still a sense in which I'm not leaving imagination primitive.
Right. I see.
Yeah.
So the sense in which you can define pretense without imagination is the sense that you don't need to invoke some kind of primitive notion of imagination to make sense of it. Because all you have to
Hmm.
do is say, well, they've got to be acting a certain way intentionally, which entails that
Hmm.
they have certain beliefs, and then also that happens to be what I analyze imagination in. So the two connect up afterwards.
Right, right.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay. All right. Well, I didn't mean to preview so many interesting issues, but they all are bound together. So I was because I was just
Right.
really curious about like how tight the relationship between like your claim that there's something central about imagination to the mind, such that it can't be carved off. And you say these things like, well, if you lack the imagination, then you couldn't pretend. You'd be super honest. You'd fail at charades, and you wouldn't be very good at all these other things. And I was like, huh, does this way of putting things kind of presuppose your view, or is it that on any sort of view about imagination, you would make these kind of claims? But it sounds like it's not really the case that on a neutral conception of imagination, well, I don't know about neutral, but on a maybe an alternative conception of what imagination is, maybe you could carve it off, and people could still go around and lie
Yeah.
and example those sorts of things, or is it more
Yeah.
universally accepted in the imagination literature that if you lacked it, then you would also fail at these other things?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. I mean, because it gets to so yeah, I mean, look, on the one hand, there was something, tendentious is too strong a word, but something loaded in my suggestion at the beginning to say, oh yeah, you just couldn't be human, you couldn't carve it off. So
Right.
you're right to be alerted, like, are you sure? Are you sure you're not building your view in here already? But I'm also trying to, I list all those things because these are all phenomena where philosophers have said, oh, to explain this, we gotta invoke imagination. you know. So I said, yeah, you'd be terrible. You couldn't lie, you couldn't empathize, you couldn't win at charades, you couldn't enjoy fiction. Like so because we need imagination, right? Philosophers have been saying we need imagination to do those things. And then I say, to extent to when you got to the point where you couldn't do any of those things, you just wouldn't even be you anymore.
Right.
Now, you're right. Under pressure, they could turn around and say, well, I mean, we theorized about imagination. We think it's central to these things and important, but we could still conceive of situations where you don't use imagination, but you still manage to pretend, or you still manage to enjoy the fiction. Or you say,
Right.
well, okay, but once they say that, I've kind of got my foot in the door, like, right? Say, oh, so there are some cases.
Right.
Oh, okay. So it's not strictly necessary to, it's just like, oh, it helps. Oh, okay. Well, let's peer into that then. Like, let's look at the case where you feel like, no, but here's where you really need it, or was especially helpful. Are you sure about those? Right. And then, then we're having a discussion. Then we're having the discussion that I want to have. Because it's not commonly observed as you have just kind of raised. It's not commonly observed in the literature, like when people invoke imagination, just like they're not quick to say, of course, you don't need it for this, right?
Right.
We often use it for that because that as soon as you say you don't need it to, gain modal knowledge in all instances, or you don't need it to, enjoy fiction, we just sometimes use. Then your discussion gets a lot harder because it's like, oh, okay, where are you drawing the line between these cases that you have allowed that you don't need this sweet, generous kind of primitive imagining, and the cases where you do need it. So that's just to say that, yeah, it's a fair question. Yeah, it's a bit loaded the way I start the book, but it's just to try to get you in the mood of
It
it being a
did.
comedy.
Yes. I'm immediately in
Okay.
the mood. Okay.
Okay.
And so we've already sort of previewed this a little bit, but so your view is that the imagination can be, I don't know if reduced is the right word, but so I want to ask you, is that the right word? But reduced to other cognitive faculties that involve just ordinary beliefs and desires, and so that every case involving imagination is gonna turn out to be just a case of ordinary beliefs and desires, not like, I mean, I was surprised by how many letter dash then a word there are in the imagination literature. So there's I desires and S desires,
Mhm.
F imagination. And so, okay, whatever. But it's not some weird special desire like thing. It's not some
Right.
alternate
Right.
thing. It's just an ordinary belief. The content will be different. We'll talk about that. But that's
Yeah.
your strategy, is to try to in every case show that it's just ordinary folk psychological things.
Right. 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 Yeah, that's exactly it. And then, you can talk about in what sense is this a reduction? In what sense are these more basic? Those are things I talk about in places, but yeah, they're supposed to be ordinary beliefs. Now, part of it is I also have a view they've developed where an ordinary belief can have a mental image, say, as a constituent. So not
Yeah,
everyone has that sort of view. So that kind of brings in some of the sensory imagination stuff, which sometimes just gets carved off. It's like, well, we know our beliefs are, amodal and propositional and so on, and sensory imagination is something else. Which I don't, accept that view.
right.
And so that allows me to say that yes, they're ordinary beliefs. Some of these ordinary beliefs have mental images as proper parts,
Hmm.
but they're still ordinary beliefs or desires. Some of our desires have mental images as proper parts too. So that might help people sort of understand how the imagery gets involved in this.
So I'm
Uh,
wondering if you could just say a little bit. I mean, you say a lot of bit about it in the book, but I wonder if you could say a little bit here about what the alternative view is. What's the view that you're challenging? The idea that there's
yeah,
some sui generis imaginative
yeah,
thing. Like, what do they mean by that? Which is that you're in
yeah,
opposition to.
yeah. So the opposition view is something like, well, look, suppose someone's imagining, going for a run right now. We could list, if you just it off all their current beliefs, desires, and intentions, probably even hopes and wishes, or any other kind of, just about any other folk psychological term you can. If you just create a whole list of those, um, and you created some other mind with all those states in it, you wouldn't have yet have a mind that's imagining, right? Because imagining something on top of all those, something distinct from those, it's its own type of mental state that occurs, is maybe influenced by those and so on, but it's importantly distinct. Um, just like most people see belief and desire as distinct states. So if you list all of someone's beliefs, you still don't know what they desire.
Mhm.
Suppose, if you think. So same way, if you list off, all these other states, you still haven't captured, you still haven't fully described what's going on with them mentally, because you haven't captured their imagining. Whereas on my view, I suggest like if you do give a full account of their beliefs, in their judgments, their decisions, it's important to kind of bring in the current versions of these states, their intentions. You list all of that, you've captured the fact that they are imagining in that list of states.
Mhm. Okay.
Some states among those are sufficient for qualifying them as engaging in the relevant imagining. Um, and this, just differs from context to context. It is kind of a heterogeneous bunch. But a lot of people think, it's kind of clear even from a distance that imagination seems to get invoked in a lot of different ways in different contexts. So shouldn't be super surprising that it's kind of a heterogeneous bunch of stuff that's going on. But the important point for me is that you can capture what's going on psychologically without invoking this distinct state of imagining. But, most everybody else most people, in the literature are really committed to this distinct state. It's
Yeah.
very similar to a belief or similar to perception, but importantly distinct from it. And that's the key view that really I'm just kind of trying to challenge again and again, throughout the
And so
book.
this other the distinct state view, it's often, I mean, so you just mentioned perception, but I was struck a lot by a lot of the contrasts and the people you quote and the things they're talking about are saying it's, contrasted with belief and desire, but it's not contrasted with like visual perception versus auditory perception. So I was curious, like why belief and desire like as opposed to uh, visual like or auditory like, or is there that distinction? Is that the distinction between imagistic imagining and what you call attitudinal imagining, or is that a separate kind of distinction? Or so, and what part of why I'm asking this question is because I would have thought that part of the way you want to distinguish these things is in terms of like some kind of phenomenal character or some kind of quality that's associated with imagination. Whereas it seems like it's really more associated with like the functional role, which is how I would associate people distinguishing beliefs from desires in terms of the functional role in the mind, as opposed to the way we distinguish audition from visual stuff, which is in terms of some kind of phenomenal character. So I wonder, is that a distinction that's made in this area, or is it often thought in terms of the functional stuff?
Yeah, it's both, so it's very common in this area to. So, like, for instance, Curry and Ravenscroft have a 2002 book that's been influential called Recreative Minds. And in there, as in some other places, they're like, there's just two importantly different kinds of imagination. One recreates perception, so it's like perception-like imagining, what you might think of as sensory imagining. And then there's one kind that recreates belief, which
Mm.
you might think is like belief-like imagining, or sometimes called propositional imagining by others. And then they kind of theorize about those separately. Um, so the phenomenal character will be more relevant to the sensory imaginings, functional role more relevant to the belief-like imaginings. Um, so
But is there a phenomenal character distinctive of the imagination part, or is it just that there's like sensory phenomenal character used imaginatively or something like that? So is there a what it's like to imagine? It's what kind of what I'm asking according to your
Yeah.
views.
Well, yeah, their views on this differ. So
Okay.
yeah, there are a lot of different views on this. So some people think, well, not all imagery is, I guess I think, not all imagery is sensory imagining.
Hmm.
Or at least you might feel like you want to say that. You might think sensory imagining is more like, considering the merely possible, whereas, when I like imagine the Cheerios I had this morning for breakfast, that's just like representing something of the past using an imagery. That's, that the phenomenology of that is different than the sort of more possibility oriented imagining. So therefore it's not imagining, it's just remembering, say. So the relationship between remembering and imagining, comes up here.
Hmm.
How to understand those if they both involve mental imagery and both phenomenally similar in that sense. Is there a further phenomenal difference between, phenomenology of remembering, phenomenology of sensory imagining that's not remembering, and trying to get into that. And I've gotten into those things a bit, and sort of later I've done some work on episodic memory since the book, since there's a good sort of literature going on that and the relation of that to imagination. So sort of dealt. So there are those questions. Were you asking about, is there a phenomenology of like belief-like imagining,
Yeah.
or that, some people will say yes, but others no. I haven't dwelt on those questions.
Okay.
But I was sort of drawn to the stuff on propositional imagining initially from a 2000 Sean Nichols and Stephen Stitch paper, a cognitive theory of pretense, which appeared in Cognition, which is really a nice, if you were going to have this sort of a distinct state view of like a belief like imagining,
Hmm.
that would be the view to have. It was really nicely developed in a lot of detail. Like they're trying to do a kind of formal boxology where you got your belief box, your desire box, and the imagination box, and trying to support the belief in this element, this distinct element of cognitive architecture by appeal to results on pretense in children and things like that. Um, and then so another way I sort of entered the imagination literature was through interest in that work. And that's has nothing to do with phenomenology, has nothing to do with imagery even. They are really focused on this question of like, how do you keep in mind stuff that you're pretending?
Hmm.
This just without getting confused. Psychologists who thought that there's this problem, like how do we keep these two different mental registries, like the pretended world from what I really believe? Like that seems like ripe for confusion. The what we're what what's pretended must be cognitively quarantined from our actual beliefs, and they try to map this out in a rigorous way. But at the same time, it has to be deeply informed by what you believe.
Right.
Like you can't pretend to be at a tea party without drawing all your beliefs about, well, what is a tea party? What goes on at tea parties? It's all got to kind of make it into imagination too. And so they got this whole kind of picture about how there's this interaction between boxes, but they're still distinct boxes.
Right.
And so that's a aspect of the imagination literature. It has nothing to do with imagery, nothing to do with phenomenology, and it has to do with like quarantining, is what they think of it as. And people interested in hypothetical reasoning and conditional reasoning might be interested in that kind in imagination in that kind of way too. Like, oh, they're
Right.
not so much interested, but like, how do we keep these things we don't yet believe, but we're trying to work out the consequences of it? How do we keep them in mind so that we can do those kinds of hypothetical reasonings? So that's that's an aspect of the whole imagination literature that's kind of off to the side of the concerns about like mental imagery and things, though they do get mixed together too, because someone might say, oh, in pretense and hypothetical reasoning, you got to have the imagery in there too. So how's that going to
Mm.
work?
I mean,
But for
part
people,
of the reason why I was asking those because I was trying to find the motivation for well this deep-seated desire it seems that some theorists have for there to be a separate state that's not belief or desire. And I was wondering if is there appeals to like the phenomenology. I know there's some stuff about well they just seem different in terms of like their results and stuff like that, and we can get into that in just a bit where they say like, it's not belief because and then they give some reasons because beliefs act this way but pretense it doesn't act that way allegedly. But is there something more to it? Is there supposed to be like well, you can kind of tell introspectively when you're imagining, and it doesn't seem belief-like. Or is there any aspect of that that's motivating theorists to posit this sui generis imaginative state?
I mean, I think there is, but they also like aren't going to try to found their arguments on. They're going to try to found their arguments on something else. But I do
Okay.
think that's driving. People, David Vellman sometimes gets quoted as like, yeah, he considers in some of his work like whether you could pretend, using just beliefs and so on, and yeah, it's conceivable, but it would be depressing, depressingly, like what a depressing view, Uh,
Bummer.
yeah, what a bummer, man. Yeah, like um, depressingly unchildlike if you were just consulting your beliefs,
Okay.
like let me see what I believe, as though that, So, I think there's a sort kind of a sympathy for the imagination being this sort of, untamed horse of the mind,
Mhm.
that you're going to harness occasionally. And let's not say it's belief. And okay, if we can find an argument for this view, great. If we can't, we're just not going to believe that other view anyway. Like, I
Yeah.
don't know.
I mean, that's interesting because I also was wondering, like, I just sort of in response to your views, do, I was wondering if, like, the debate between you and someone who has this sui generis view, does it often turn out to be like the debate between, like, a, dualist with respect to consciousness and like an illusionist with respect to consciousness, sort of one thinking, no, you've explained it away, and the other side saying, no, I'm trying to say what it is. Is
Hmm.
there a kind
Hmm.
of, do you think there's a parallel there in this imagination debate?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there is. Um, Yeah, I think, I've kind of treaded into this like the first, known materialist or something, I don't know, or the first known reductivist of imagination literature or something, but like, um, yeah, I said in a piece, okay, so there's going to be a it really echoes what you just said. There's going to be a symposium in analysis on the book late arriving in a few months. And Neil Van Leeuwen, who does great work on imagination, he's one of the commentators. And one of the things he's like accused me of, is like, oh, you know, um, you're trying to your view is like okay you're really working hard to be parsimonious and doing without this extra thing of imagination but it's like he says it's penny wise parsimony because like it's just not that costly to add imagination to the view and then you can much easier explain stuff than and not having to bend backwards and doing all your contortions to explain imagination within these ways. Like, you just appeal to imagination, and then you can do all this great work. So don't worry, don't be so penny wise with your parsimony, um, or pound foolish or whatever with the parsimony. And my response to that was sort of like, well. That's from a perspective where you say, oh, we're both kind of explaining the same things, but I'm just working super hard to make do without imagination. Why am I doing that? But we're not, there's one big thing that you're not explaining, which is imagination.
Yeah.
Like I'm explaining something that you're not. So we're not, it's not like two views and one's just a little bit more parsimonious. It's like, no, it's one view that's explaining imagination, the other that's not. And
It's just
and
helping
I think
themselves
that
to it in a way.
yeah, they're helping themselves to it in
Yeah.
a way, and then what they say about it is not internally consistent. If you it's like this is one of my complaints about imagination, and probably happens in similar things in the conscious literature. It's like people say a lot of things about imagination, like it can do this, it can do that. Sometimes it does this, sometimes it does the other. Sometimes it's just one thing, but there's seemingly like if you were to add up all the sort of platitudes about imagination, like what it's apt to do, what's apt to cause it, and what it's apt to cause in return,
Hmm.
it's a big mess. Like, oh, it might cause it. It's not going to give you some nice, sort of functional role, then we'll find the occupant of the role. You know, it's in one case it's going to trigger strong emotions. Another time you might imagine, oh, it doesn't trigger any emotions. Or, one time you imagine something and you draw out kind of very realistic, things from it. Other times you imagine and you get completely unrealistic things. Like so, and they just say that it can do this, it can do that. And it's fine to list all of those things, but you're not actually giving anything, you're not saying anything particularly helpful, or is it if you're trying to give a theory of it. Like if you just want to appeal to imagination and to explain something else, like okay, fine. The less you say about imagination, the less helpful that is. But still, you can do that. But I guess what I say in defense of my approach is I'm actually trying to say something about imagination
Right.
itself. And then,
And also, I mean, throughout the book, you make this argument, which I think is really clever, which is you kind of try to say, look, here's my explanation of relevance phenomenon X, Y, or whatever. And then it just turns out that this like sui generis imaginative state is redundant. Like what work would it really do? It doesn't seem like it's really explaining anything at all. And so I think that the strategy is successful, in my opinion, that it was like, to me, it revealed that, yeah, that's part of why I was asking, like, why are they so gung ho about the need for this thing when the explanations that you provide kind of show that it's in the end redundant, that all the work is done already. So why need posit this extra strange thing? So yeah, I just found that to be somewhat curious. Maybe I was too convinced by your view, but it did strike me.
well, that was the point of the book. It's supposed to be convincing, but
Exactly.
no, but I mean, appreciate. I mean, I'm sure we could get it. The sweet generous imagination folks here, and they would start to, you know, try to point to the clunkier parts of my view.
Yeah,
But
because it doesn't seem like you're contorting yourself. So, I mean, just to give an example for the people listening, like let's take, I guess, since we've been talking about pretense so much, I mean, there's so many other things as well, but starting with pretense,
you know,
like how would you explain? I don't know why everyone has to pretend about tea parties. Like, what is this obsession with tea parties? But all right, so how do you explain the pretense of a tea party without invoking the sui generis imaginative state? Well, you
right.
already
So
said, I guess, so we know a little bit, but can we make it explicit?
yeah, sure. So there was a famous experiment, I think it was Alan Leslie did, where young children like 2 or 3 years old, are having a tea party. They understand the tea party. And there's actually one interesting portion of it, like two cups, they have a couple cups on the table. The experimenter pretends to pour tea in both of them. And then, of course, no tea is actually poured. And then takes one of the cups and shakes it like this and puts it back down, right? And so then the child is asked, which one of these has tea in it?
Hmm.
And they correctly point just to the one that wasn't turned upside down. Now,
And it's all the
child
kids
follows,
do this, right? There's no kids that fail this test.
I mean, I think by three, they're all doing really well.
Okay.
I can't remember the exact, there's certain ages where it's less so, but I think at least by then. Yeah, this is, and interestingly, they say, not only is it a case of pretending something that you don't believe, namely that there's pretending, that there's tea in there. She's also pretending what she believes, namely that she believes the other one is empty, and she's also pretending that it's empty
Hmm.
because that's why she only points to the other one. So you can, and this is interesting. It seems to be some sort of double dissociation between, if you can put it that way, you know, belief and imagination. You can imagine what you disbelieve, but you can also imagine what you believe. You can or pretend, and you can also pretend what you believe. You can pretend what you disbelieve. We all know that, but you can also pretend things that you believe. And that actually does create a wrinkle when you try to define what it is to pretend in terms of belief, because it seems like, oh, wait, I can't say that it's pretending that P while believing that not P, because the child is pretending that one of the cups is empty and believes that it's empty.
Right.
So that leads to like a further leg. And my answer to that is like, well, it's not really that deep of a puzzle. It's all in the context of some larger story, part of which she doesn't believe, you know. And so there's got to be something you disbelieve in the vicinity of what's going on here for it to be pretense, and then other things that you believe can come along. So I can pretend that I'm a philosophy professor giving a lecture, even if I'm not, you know, when I'm not really giving a lecture, even if I believe I'm a philosophy professor, because, well, I don't believe I'm really giving a lecture right now. It's in
Hmm.
the context of that. Anyway, so, but those are these interesting, like little psychological, little philosophical points, I guess, that, you know, if you're not appreciating it, has have like driven people, even, you know, psychologists working on it, people like Alan Leslie and, you know, um, Ori Friedman, who say he's not, you know, motivated by that, but you know, to think that, yeah, we really got to think of it as this distinct state because, yeah, you can pretend what you can. It's just it's just totally irrelevant what you believe. You might pretend it or not be pretending it or not. Or, anyway, so but what goes on for me when the child pretends that the cups are, you know, one's empty, one's full, the child recognizes that we're playing a game, okay, through kind of manner cues and things, which are important. Those have been studied, you know, like winks and nods and things. Like when we sort of grasp that someone's pretending, it's not a trivial recognition when we recognize that about something. Okay, we're playing this game where we act like things are a way that they're not really.
Hmm.
Okay, something like that. Like this is the kind of game we do sometimes. And experimenters just acted like she poured tea the uh, in the cups. I understand this game. That means I should act like there's tea in the cups, you know. So I believe, and then oh, look, the experimenter picked a cup up and turned it over. What would happen? Now the child has to think, what would happen? Ask yourself, you know, what would happen if a cup with tea in it were turned over? So now we get this sort of hypothetical reasoning part. Does she need to imagine or have some non belief state at this crucial point? This is a point where some people might say, yeah, she needs to represent in her mind a full cup was turned over, right? And that
Hmm.
can't be a belief because she doesn't believe one was. But I say, no, I mean, she just needs to think, well, what has happened in the past when cups I've seen have been turned over? Well, in my experience, when a cup gets turned over, the stuff spills out of it. Um, you know, in this case, therefore, if this cup had stuff in it and was turned over, it would now be empty. So there's, and I'm not saying all conditional reason can get that analysis, but sometimes if you got a lot of relevant past experience, you know, like every time I've seen people turn over cups many times and stuff, and you can infer from that, well, if someone had just now overturned another cup, it would be empty too.
Hmm.
Now I should play along. I should act as I would if it were empty. And I should act as if it were, as I should for the other one if it were full. And so you're keeping track of what's going on in the game. Like in the game, he turned this over. I got to remember that, you know. I got to think about what happens with cups and stuff. And I need to, engage sometimes in some hypothetical reasoning, but that hypothetical reasoning might just only require beliefs
So,
about how
which
things tend
beliefs
to go.
does the child have on your view? Like, like because it's part of your view that she has beliefs and she actually believes. I mean, that's probably redundant, but she actually has these things which she really believes, whereas a lot of people want to say, no, she can't really believe the things she's pretending because they're all like
Yeah,
false and she doesn't think they're true. So, on your
yeah,
view, there's a distinctive content to those beliefs. What is
right.
it?
Yeah, so she believes that we are acting like there's tea in the cups. We're acting as would be appropriate if there's tea in the cups, so you can put it that way.
Hmm.
She believes that if a full cup had been turned over, it would now be empty. So she has that's a belief in the conditional. Um, she believes she should play along, and believes she should act like the cup is empty. Um, those are some of the beliefs. And
Okay.
so, and they're, in more complex pretenses like this, like unlike the lion case we talked about earlier, there will often be a belief in a condition like a if then, if this had happened, then this would happen.
Hmm.
Um, and so a big part of my view is saying those are still beliefs, right? And to arrive at those beliefs, there's always some prior beliefs we can um, use to infer those conditional beliefs from them. We don't need to represent the antecedent of the conditional, like the cup is turned over in imagination as this distinct mental state in order
Right.
to just arrive at the belief. So there are a couple of chapters on that. Um,
So that's
does
the
that,
whole story. Yeah, no, exactly. I just wanted to get the whole account on the
yeah,
table so that we could see that really there doesn't
yeah,
seem to be any room left over for some kind of other state to be doing some work at this point.
right, yeah. And I mean, I try to drive it home by saying like all this reasoning, we know her beliefs need to be highly relevant to her ability to pretend. Like all this stuff about she needs to have beliefs about what tends to happen when
Hmm.
cups get turned over. You don't have any beliefs about that prior to sitting down. It says, imagining anything is not going to help you, right? If you've never seen a cup get overturned or never seen liquids, it's not going to help you. Imagining is not going to help you figure out how to act when the experimenter goes like that. You're going to be totally puzzled. So
Right.
clearly, beliefs need to be richly involved, and this is true even on the Nichols and Stitch uh, view. On their view, well, all of your beliefs get copied into imagination.
Hmm.
And then in certain ones are weeded out that don't fit with what you're imagining, and then you kind of go from there. And that's like, well, that's pretty heavy duty stuff to like copy all my beliefs. Why not? Are you sure I can't just make do with my beliefs and skip the imagination part? Are you absolutely sure? Like let's. And so I think, yeah, I think you can. Yeah. So then I try to press that point against it. Like the beliefs are gonna have to evolve. So it really is just like what is absolutely necessary about this crucial moment when you step outside of your beliefs.
Right.
You have some representation that's like a sweet, generous imagining. Like what do we really want from that we can't get from just a platitude? Oh yeah, but they're imagining she's imagining she's at a tea party. But what we mean by that is all this psychological stuff that's going on with her acting this way, acting that way, drawing on beliefs and hypotheticals and so on.
Hmm.
You don't
And
need to
still
just.
childlike.
It's still it's still
Yeah.
refreshingly childlike.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's beautiful.
exactly.
It's beautiful for the children. This view is
It's
for
for
the
the
children.
children. But and so on your view, I mean, so you make this distinction, which we really haven't talked about too much, between attitudinal imagination and imagistic imagination. And so this is all in terms of attitudinal or a imagining, as you would put it. So even if the child kind of pictures some imaginary liquid flowing out of the overturned teacup, that could still be playing the role of a belief or judgment in your view. Is that right? So that it would
Yeah,
you could all be sort of propositional in some sense.
yeah. Like so, one of her beliefs, on my view, could be something like, you know, liquid flowing out of the cup would look like thus and such,
Hmm. And then she
and that
pictures it.
thus and such is filled in by an image. And that's now she's involved in some sensory imagining, but that was really just a judgment about like what the scenario would look like were it to occur.
Hmm.
That's a belief she has. Like she really thinks, like, yeah, if you had done overturned liquid and gone like this, it would really look about like that. She's using her image to represent.
And
That's
that's a
still,
somewhat controversial view, though, right? I mean, do you find resistance to that?
yeah, I do, but this is an interesting place where I haven't gotten as much pushback as you might think.
Mm.
Um, because I've had this view, since I think I first published it like a paper in 2015 saying, hey, we got they're just ordinary beliefs or judgments with that mental images as proper parts. I know there's a whole tradition in philosophy that says your beliefs are non-imagistic. Because they're I don't know, they're amodal, they represent propositions. You couldn't have an image be part of that. Um, but there's a problematic interaction of different formats and things, and it's sort of there's different possible objections you could raise, but that's just very much a kind of received view. Like I've never found the
That's
elusive, like,
fine.
where is the paper where it's written where that has to be so? You know what I mean? I feel like there's this paper like someone showed like, oh yeah, belief has to get that analysis, and then we don't know what to say about all the imagery we're using because those aren't our beliefs, it's just stuff's kind of swirling around. Hume didn't have that view, like, right? Any empiricist doesn't thinks that, beliefs are constituted by imagery or like,
Right.
any kind of critical empiricist. So there's this whole there, you know, um, I don't know if it's like a kind of Fodorian kind of background
Yeah,
assumption
I would
that
say.
drives that.
I
Uh,
wonder if also there's some precedent for this kind of view in the phenomenal concept strategy literature where people talk about, using the experience itself as part of a concept or something like that. And I
yeah,
know, Ned Block has a view where he thinks that imagistic things can be cognitively enveloped and used in working memory and stuff like that. So maybe the view is becoming more, people are becoming more open to this idea,
yeah,
um, which is nice.
yeah,
One
yeah.
question I have about it though is, um, and which I didn't really see you talk about in the book, so I was curious about what your view was, because we often are very comfortable talking about unconscious beliefs and desires. Um, and if we can have these kind of imagistic beliefs or desires, does that commit you to there being occurrences of these things unconsciously? Or not? Or I just wondered, like, can these kind of imagistic attitudes occur unconsciously, according to your account? So maybe you can have unconscious imagination, imagistic, or
Yeah.
something.
I mean, nothing I say would rule that out,
Mhm.
and I don't know. Yeah. And so,
Well, some people
I
commit
don't,
very heavily to the idea that mental images have to be sort of like, conscious in this perspective there.
yeah.
So I was
Yeah.
curious.
I don't see any, yeah, I don't have that view,
Okay.
I think it's just as apt to be unconscious as any other type of
So you'd be
state.
fine with like an unconscious imagining.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know, I'd have to think about the situations where I say that that has occurred, but I don't have any sort of, a priori reason to think that that's not possible or something.
Okay.
You know, yeah,
And so, and the other thing which you don't talk about a lot about in the book is the imagistic kind of imagining. And you sort of focus the whole book around attitudinal imagining, which is fine. It's not an objection or anything, but I am curious, like, so do you have a view about imagistic imagining?
um, I've been working on that a little bit in a little more detail recently. So, I mean, there's a lot of questions you can raise about it. Um, so. So when you ask like, do you have a view about imagistic imagining? It's like, well, are you saying like, what is the question? Is it, do I have a view about when people make use of mental images, or or is it a more like, so are you talking about like, so you're going to include episodic memory in that? Do you have,
Hmm.
and not, and in other cases where you use mental imagery, or is it something else? No, or is it something else like, no, I mean sensory imagination that's not memory, that's more like using mental images. If it's just like using mental images, but with this sort of attitude of imagining attached to them, then I feel like, well, I did say a good amount about that.
Hmm.
But yeah, clearly there's a lot more that could be said. Um, and some things here's something that I've been kind of, I guess, something I've been kicking around in a draft paper, that maybe would speak to your question, like, but you're still not talking about sensory imagination. Sort of interested in, uh, I've been astounded as everybody with like and the new generative AI stuff and image generating AI,
Hmm.
such as like Midjourney and DALL-E 3 and all that kind of stuff. Um, I think those can provide some interesting analogies for thinking about imagistic imagination. So, writing in the prompt, right? You write in this prompt what you want, and then you get some interesting image related to the prompt, thanks to this really, huge network that's carefully weighted and so on, through trained through, obviously. Um, Now, what can we say about? I think that's an interesting way to think about imagistic imagination, um, because on that sort of view, okay, so the common view, the sort of the paired view that goes with sort of the sui generis imagination view that I've sort of been arguing against. The paired view for sensory imagination is that like sensory imagination is kind of like this free kind of, unconstrained capacity, that when we want to use it for serious business, like figuring out how to get home or to some place or whether the couch fits through the door, we can constrain it in ways, but otherwise it's just kind of this free floating thing. Um, that's the kind of view that to me feels like it's a non-view because it's not really placing any real constraints on what the nature of imagination itself is.
Hmm.
Um, so I said, well, but look at these, generative AI algorithms. On the one hand, they're highly constrained. In fact, they're nothing but constraints, right?
Right.
And on the other hand, you can get as wild or fantastical a thing out of it as you want. So in that sense, it's completely unconstrained in what it can imagine. Like you can put a unicorn jumping over, three elves, whatever, and then it's going to use its completely very tightly constrained network to generate this fantastical image.
Hmm.
Um, so my suggestion is like stop think of sensory imagination more like that. We've got this like carefully weighted, trained ability just through our past experience of the world that we can rely on. It's always tightly constrained. Okay. But we can rely on it to generate crazy, fantastical stuff or really serious stuff. Like getting, am I going to succeed in jumping over this, river or whatever? Let me kind of feed into this, carefully trained visual offline network, the input and see what I get. I think people have sometimes, mistaken the fact that you can get wild, you can ask the network to generate kind of bizarre, weird stuff or really realistic stuff for they've mistaken that as for the idea that imagining itself has no constraints or no nature to it. It's
Right.
just like unpredicted and needs to be constrained when you're actually serious about getting something serious done. Whereas I think even when you're just fantasizing or mind wandering, you're probably making use of the very same complete, whether you use the AI generator, right, to like get the project at work done or to just make a goofy, screensaver, um, you're still making use of all the same constraints.
Mm.
And if you want to know the nature of the thing, then you're going to want an account of all, in the case of the image generating, the account of the deep neural network and all the weightings and so on, and that will be an account of imagination, you know,
Mm.
that tells you something about how it
Mm.
works. And it's
What-
one where it has sort of the same, where it is, yeah. So I'm like, not that, I don't know how far we can take the analogies between deep neural networks and the human mind. Like, obviously, that's a really interesting and active area of research.
Yeah.
But I think that's a case where we could usefully think about possible analogies to kind of think about sensory imagination differently.
Interesting. So would you be inclined to say that these systems are imagining or that some ancestor system of them could?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, I don't see a reason. I don't see a reason for deep skepticism about it. I put it that way. This is all very new. We're trying to understand the relationships of these systems to human minds. We're trying to understand how deep the analogies go. Clearly, the whole fact that they're based on artificial neural networks and artificial neural networks bear structural similarities to actual human networks. That's important.
Yeah.
That's, but we also know there are deep differences. But I've been writing about this also separately, just about, LLMs and connectionism and things. I've sort of been getting into this a bit.
I mean, you do
You
bring
know,
up like generative adversarial networks in the sort of last chapter of your book as
oh
well.
yeah, right. Yeah, it was just beginning to come out then. And yeah, and I talked about that, finding it pretty thought-provoking stuff. And so yeah, um I'm definitely interested in that. And I think from my standpoint, it could be that LLMs and the image generating things are kind of working completely differently than human minds do. But it also seems that would be, you know, this isn't any kind of argument. It's just sort of observation. Like, you know, wow, how it'd be wild if you could get something so, tweaked as like human cognition, apparent human cognition in two completely different ways.
Right.
Like, are you sure there's not some,
Especially when one
it,
is kind of modeled on the other.
right. Yeah. When you couldn't have developed one without being on the other, are you sure that it didn't sort of ultimately sort of latch on to the way the prior one's actually working?
Hmm.
Uh, so,
I mean, that's kind
so
of interesting because I mean, many people find, well, creativity generally speaking, but this kind of imagination that you're talking about to be sort of the thing which these machines will never be able to do, and find something kind of unimaginative or uncreative about the outputs of Dolly 3 and in that kind of case. And so it sounds like what you're suggesting is that that's too quick.
yeah, yeah, I think it is. I mean, that's something I've been thinking about, more since the book too. And it's just, um, these things that we actually get to interact with, they're made to be mass market. They're made to like please everybody as much as possible, right?
Mhm.
Like they're trained on, kind of an indiscriminate variety of all kinds of stuff, But if you just make some sort of relatively shallow tweaks to them, like, well, we're not going to try to please everybody with its outputs, and we're just training it um a kind of curated selection of works and things and reinforced for certain traits in the work. And so as actual artists are, you give it a much more different, then I think you quickly get things that seem much more creative, much
Mhm.
less bland. And there's a guy, El Gamal at Rutgers Cognitive Science who's done some interesting work like that, like
Mhm.
they actually reinforced for certain traits of like originality and so on and I can't remember. There are a couple different ones, but they're essentially just trying to train it not to, please everybody, but to sort of mirror, traits of the most, respected artworks of the 20th century while still being a little bit different from them or something like that.
Mhm. Yeah.
And when they did that, the outputs were not discriminable by ordinary folks, from
Mm.
like they were preferred as like seemed more artistic than,
So
the work of
interesting.
actual artists,
I'll
So,
just say anecdotally that my wife and I went to the MoMA recently, and we went in, and they had this like giant like morphing mural thing on the front wall. It was like just changing into all different sorts of things, and it looked some of it looked Picasso like, some of it looked Van Gogh like, then it was abstract, and then it was like realistic. And we were like sitting there, and there's little benches so you can sit there and watch it. And we were like, "Whoa, this thing is amazing!" We were thinking it was some digital artist or something like that. And then as we left, we read the little inscription. It was like, "This is a generative AI that's been trained on all the artwork in the MoMA and is like come up with its own original things." And I was like,
wow.
I would not have guessed that that was AI. Like it was so strikingly cool and original. I was like kind of blown
Yeah.
away. And that's kind of a critique that you hear sometimes about these AIs is that they're not truly original. They're all just taking the training data and then rearranging it. And then I hear you kind of saying is like, we're already kind of doing that. Like that's what people are already kind of doing. It's not, so in that sense, like are they much different than what we're doing? That's why I guess your view would be they could be really original in that sense, like something truly original could be produced by this sort of method.
Yeah. I mean, it just doesn't seem that different from, human artists being trained by other human artists
Right.
and influenced by, all that training. And then it refracts through their particular differences in their history and sensibility to something a bit different, but it's still, influenced in that way.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's a lot to say about that. One of the other things I kind of very interested in, the creative process, and in the book I sort of quote some like songwriters and how much they kind of invoke the unconscious,
Hmm.
when they're talking about where their best ideas come from.
Right.
Um, because, once, one thing people say that, well, the AI can't be created because it's not conscious or whatever. And then, questions about creativity get wrapped up in questions about consciousness. One interesting thing that seems possible with creativity is you can possibly avoid questions about consciousness by saying, and even agency, more controversially, I guess, but by saying, well, even if you ask actual artists about, at least many, about their actual how the process, they're sort of like, it's not conscious, that's
Yeah.
not where the good idea. I mean, they can be kind, but if I sit down and try to consciously write the song, or and so it's not going to be nearly as good or original as if I just kind of get myself in a state. I don't know how it happens, and
Right.
and
And
control
I
it.
forget who it was that you quoted, but they said, if I start to think about it, I stop.
Yeah,
Because that's when it gets messed
yeah,
up. It's like,
yeah,
so I got to just let it go, get
yeah,
out of my own
yeah.
way, so to speak. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that was Neil Young.
Right.
So,
Okay.
yeah, so sort of, you take consciousness out of it, um and then you think about the different kinds of trainings something could have. And then there's just this broader question, is like, well, is that a bad thing if AI is genuinely creative? Like, it feels, naturally it feels a little like, ooh, you know, but why, so is it the same
Mhm.
kind of thing, like just conscious AI seems
Yeah.
settling, or is it something else?
Well, I mean, I feel
So
like just off the cuff, I would say we've been trained through science fiction for so long to be thinking of AI as hyper rational and logical. And then what the true AI turned out to be was really creative and good at humanities. And it's just not what we
yeah,
expected, you know?
yeah, that's right. Right, yeah. Yeah, I was like, yeah, it's not logical and I love it, man, yeah.
Exactly.
Uh,
Oh man.
yeah,
So before turning back to this, I wanted just one more question about sensory imagination. So
yeah.
are you more open there to a kind of sui generis uh, notion of imagination, or are you going to try some kind of reductive explanation in that category as well?
Um, I'm not sure how to answer that, but I'm open to the idea that, look, there are some questions you can only answer, some things you can only do by like relying on your like a sensory motor knowledge, certain kind of sensory motor know-how
Hmm.
that you develop through actually perceiving the world. And um, you could describe it just loosely as like through simulating a certain situation. Um, I don't, and could that be carved off from other things? Maybe parts of it could, not so I don't think you could lose your full imagination, right? But like this ability, like I'm curious in your sort of case of aphantasia, like, I mean, this raises a question, like, are there any things you can't do
Hmm.
well that other people can do well as a result of the aphantasia? Um, so
I mean, I would say no. It's not that I've met. I mean, I've met a
yeah,
rotation task I'm good at, and it feels like I'm doing something, to be honest. But it's not like
yeah.
picturing. I kind of feel like, well, I'm rotating something, I guess, when I imagine like, could this fit over there? But yeah, I think the data. So maybe there's some kind of unconscious image that I'm manipulating. I'm open to that idea. And I
Yeah.
like this paper that came out from I don't know if you saw it recently about aphantasia as a kind of mental blind site, by
Okay.
Ned and Jorge,
Okay.
and was it Matthias, I think. Anyway, but anyway, so I like sort of am open to those kinds of views. But as far as I know, there isn't really any true deficits. I know many people are surprised, like they say, you have aphantasia, which I only found out about in grad school, by the way, when we were discussing speckled hens and how many, that old chestnut. And I was like, wait, you guys
Yeah.
are actually picturing hens in your head? Like what the, that was a very bizarre moment for me. But anyway, I love to read. And I want to ask you about fiction before I know your time. You can't stay here forever, but I do want to try to get to that. I love fiction. I've always loved fiction. And a lot of people, when they find out I have aphantasia, they're like, wait, how do you read books? Like, what are you doing? I was like, I don't know.
That's
I'm doing
ridiculous.
something. I love it.
Yeah.
But it certainly doesn't
Uh,
involve little pictures appearing in my mind. That much is for sure.
yeah. I okay. I mean, we could talk about aphantasia too. I'm sort of like, do I see little pictures? No, I see. I wouldn't have described myself as having aphantasia, but at the same time, uh, if I was going to be at all literal about it, it's not like seeing a. It's not very like. I guess I'd say it's not very like seeing a picture.
Hmm.
But
Well, I
you're
think there's
with
a
the
range
aphantasia.
here. Some
Yeah,
people are vivid imagers and they can like picture a hyper realistic apple, like to in extreme detail. Other
yeah,
people just kind of have this like vague apple-y kind of thing, and other
yeah.
people, just like me, are just like have blank
Nothing.
space.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So I think
If
there's a
I,
bit of a range there. But like my son, my 9-year-old son, when he says he imagines an apple, it's like right before his eyes and all any amount of
yeah.
detail he wants. And I was like,
Okay. Well,
if you say so, bro, I can't even imagine what
yeah,
that's like.
yeah. Well, yeah. Well, with the just the issue about, sensory imagination, or was there a question about like does it reduce? In some ways, maybe not. You could see a joint, I guess, but it wouldn't be the sort of joint where it's like the reason we have it is because this is stuff we don't believe.
Mhm.
That's not the joint, you know.
Right.
Like it's not like we need to keep these things separate because this is all stuff we're just imagining it. No, like you use this ability and maybe you could lose that ability and still, have your others. You use these sensory kind of motor know-how to solve certain kind of questions or and things. Um, but if you think about it in attitudinal terms, there's no reason to posit some distinct attitude behind what's going on there.
Right.
Although I grant, there could be, there seems to be, there could likely be some sort of cognitive difference between, well, even the difference between semantic memory and episodic memory kind of gets. I was gonna say like, oh, you could lose your episodic memory, but still have all your semantic memory.
Hmm.
Like that's kind of like losing imagination, but still, being a rational person who knows facts and things like that. But even that's kind of questionable. Like people have been sort of questioning that distinction that's sort of been passed down from Tolving and others that there's a really deep joint here. Like
Yeah.
the memory really does seem to bleed into episodic memory, and I don't think you have much episodic memory without semantic memory. So even there, it's like, I don't know how deep the joint is. Like, yeah, I could see some of the spectrum where you use more or less of this kind of sensory motor know-how that we associate with visualizing or hearing stuff in your head,
Hmm.
but don't draw an attitude distinction in there,
Hmm.
and is what I would say. And then be very careful about what deeper distinctions you do draw. Like unless you got really clear double dissociations between those abilities. Look at contemporary, you got your large language models just dealing with a language, but then you got your other one, deep neural networks dealing with imagery and stuff. On one
Hmm.
level, this is a similar kind of architecture, even
Right.
though one's doing images and one's doing language. Like we
Interesting.
do both, like given that those two architectures very structurally similar can handle imagery or words, there's not, a lot of the kind of distinctions philosophers have kind of assumed like there's this deep image versus word-like distinction in the mind. I'm not so sure about, so I
Mhm.
don't. I don't try to build that assumption into anything that I'm doing.
Interesting. I will also, I think, just point out that I think there's some evidence that people with aphantasia have less ability with episodic memory, that they're not as good.
Okay. Okay.
So maybe that has an interesting consequence. And if episodic memory does involve images, like I have memories about things relating to me, but I can't, they're not involving any images, but I still know what I had for breakfast and what I wore
Well,
yesterday and things like that.
but
So it does seem to me that maybe there's more bleed through in that sense. But um, just really quickly, I'm getting very distracted by what you're saying. But um, when it comes to episodic memory, there's a debate about whether animals have it. Like, for example, especially certain kinds of birds that are food storers and things like that. So, is it your view then, I wonder, that they do or don't have? Because sometimes people say episodic like. So they don't have true
Mhm.
episodic memory, but they have something that's kind of like it, but it's more factual or less imagistic or something. So I will sort of wonder if you have a view about that, especially if it's related to imagination and then tied to the question of could animals not or non-humans engage in imagination?
Yeah, that's stuff. I mean, I don't have a view really about what's it like the food caching jays or
Yeah,
something,
exactly. Scrub jays.
memory, scrub jays, yeah. Um, whether that should count as episodic memory. Open to being, learning more about that. I think there could be something to, yes, I think it is an interesting topic, like why or in if, episodic memory is really far more developed in humans than other species. And I think it kind of gets to the possible relation between like semantic memory and episodic memory. Like if episodic memory were just a separate system, just like store stuff like videos, and you can just call on them, then like yeah, give it to whatever species you want. That
Right.
seems, they got the module, and then they can rewind to where they did, and but if instead it's kind of wrapped up with your whole conception of what kind of thing you are, with what kind of history
Hmm.
and what's typical for I think I am sort of sympathetic to some of the recent like constructive memory work that's pretty popular where it's like remembering is not really in general like replaying something, finding the right file to replay. It's like based on everything I know, right?
Right.
I've got at my disposal. Let me kind of construct the most plausible representation of what happened at that time. And so it's far more cognitively taxing and sophisticated thing than the more the analogy that you would draw if you think of it as like a set of video recordings. It's like I gotta do some like problem solving in a way to figure out, when I try to remember, am I remembering, 3 days ago or 2 days ago? And why would how would I tell the difference there? It's a pretty complicated thing, just
Mhm.
remembering like dinner 3 days ago as opposed to 4 days ago. Like, um, and so I would, it's from that perspective that I would sort of say, well, if that's a really important feature of episodic memory, I could see why it wouldn't be that common in a lot of other species, even if they have some
Mhm.
sort of analogous thing to some degree.
And that would
Uh,
be a link to imagination as well, on your view, wouldn't it? That
yeah,
recalling episodic memories would involve something that is, well, I mean, it would involve imagination on your account.
yeah, yeah. I talk about it as like, construct the same way people think of imagining as sort of constructive as involving some active construction of a scenario, not just a replay of some past scenario. But if
Mhm.
I'm whether I'm sort of facing the future, I'm thinking, what's going to happen tonight when I go home, and I'm drawing on what I know to try to construct an accurate representation of that. It's not a whole lot different um, if I'm trying to remember
Mhm.
something. Cognitive. We've got essentially the same systems going here. I'm just doing the best I can to construct it. And then, in the episodic memory literature, there's all this debate about, well, when do you count as really remembering it? As opposed
Exactly.
to just getting an accurate representation of it. Clearly, there's a difference between the two. And then, oh God, the ink spelled on that.
Mhm.
It's fun literature, actually. I've partaken in it, but But yeah, as you're saying, there's this connection to imagination. Then that's partly why I got drawn into it. Um,
Interesting. Okay, so I want to get to fiction if we can. You wrote three chapters of your book are on fiction,
yeah.
so it's a huge topic. We won't probably have time to cover it all, but I did want to kind of get your account of fiction. And so, one of the things that I was curious about is what your definition of fiction is. So you do state it in the book, but I wonder if you like have you changed your mind on, or what is it, what do you mean by fiction?
Okay. I think I said in the book, and it wasn't something I dwelled a lot on, but I think I said, a work of fiction is like a set of, and well, this only works. Let's just say the literary fiction, the written fiction, not like a fiction. I mean, I think it could extend to movies and things, but it's just a set of sentences. It's easier to say, um, for written fiction.
Hmm.
A set of sentences, I guess it could be, or images for a movie, put forward by an its author with the expectation that readers will not, you know, with the belief and also the expect in well, I guess with the belief that at least some or most of them are not true, and that believe and with the expectation that readers will not think that they're all true or something like that, and will read it for reasons other than gaining, knowledge about what has happened, things like for sort of entertainment or personal edification or something.
Hmm.
Something like that.
Yeah,
I mean,
something like that. That's pretty
nothing
much.
very complicated, yeah. Um, but something about like it traced to the expectations and intents of the author
Hmm.
as making it a work of fiction. So even if everything the author wrote happens coincidentally to be true, still the author put it forward with the expectation that the readers would um, not assume that everything's true, and I suppose even not think that the author was putting it forward to be believed.
Hmm.
Uh,
I mean, hence the disclaimer at the beginning. This is a work of fiction. All relations to people.
yeah, right, right, right. Let you know, right, right, right. We're all on the same page. Yeah. Um,
And so this seems like a very liberal definition, which is one of the questions I had. Is so,
okay.
um, I mean, obviously it covers, like you said, you could be easily extended to movies or other things that involve more than just sentences. But can it be like, for example, do you think of songs as fictions? Um,
Yeah. I guess my immediate answer is no.
okay.
Um, Poems, I don't think are fictions
Mm,
either.
okay. So I was curious, yeah, why, what part of the definition do they not meet?
Um, so okay, that's yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. So take a poem because it's just word and it could be all sentences. Is it important to distinguish a poem from a work of fiction?
Yeah, like Robert Frost, The Two Paths or whatever, Path Not Taken.
Uh,
It's all a set of
yeah,
sentences. You're not supposed to take them to be true, I suppose.
yeah. Is
Does it
it
have
important?
something to do maybe with the intention of the author? Because you say that ultimately it boils down to the author's prescribing that you do something, not to necessarily imagine them, but to make certain judgments or about what would be true or something in the case, I guess is how you would put it. Or
Yeah. Um, I guess, so my, why I was concerned to distinguish those um from fictions, why it would even matter, was connected to this idea that a fiction brings with it a fictional world, as you're
Mhm.
just saying, where intuitively, like certain things are the case in the fictional world that weren't explicitly stated. So, the standard examples from like, Sherlock Holmes has 10 fingers, though, it's true in the fictions. He really does have 10 fingers, suppose. But they never actually said that. So in virtue of what? And then, does it true that, how do these fictional truths get generated? And, David Lewis has an influential paper on that I was pretty sympathetic to in the book. Just saying that, well, you have to consult the consider the possible the most the nearest possible world where the fiction is told as known fact.
Mhm.
So imagine it's just being told as fact. Find the closest possible world, and you consider what else is true in that world. And this is kind of your heuristic of figuring out what's true, but merely sort of implied in the fiction. So you got that whole apparatus going, right? And when you're enjoying a fiction, now maybe so if I wanted to, and I guess I haven't thought much about this, so it's a great question. Is something like that going on when we read a poem? Is there the truth of like what's true in the poem? Like, maybe some poetry. I mean, some poetry is kind of like there's prose poetry. Like I don't know. Yeah, I don't know
Yeah.
that I'm gonna get some like, but other poetry can be highly abstract, and it's just like it seems like a misplaced question as it would be to like what's true in the symphony, like or like that's just a misplaced and then the middle place is like what's true in like the Radiohead song. It was like they got the music and the lyrics and like is there a world like where are there implicit truths generated by the Radiohead song? Like
Mhm.
uh you know
Well, that's part of what I was thinking about.
yeah.
It seems that way to me. I mean, so take a song like Jack and Diane, a little ditty about Jack
Okay.
and Diane.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a story element to a lot of songs where I guess Jack and Diane have 10 fingers, 10 hands. Hey, I guess they,
Jack did,
yeah,
but yeah.
exactly.
Uh
That's why he's so good at the football. But anyway, so in a lot of these kind of lyrical settings, it does seem as though there's a storytelling element. Not in every, maybe Radiohead's a good example of cases where that's not the case, but even some Radiohead songs, I would say, um, meet that criteria. But yeah, so I guess it's not an objection or a deep question. I would just, when I was read your definition of it, I was like, okay, this applies quite generally, right? But
yeah.
I was wondering how generally does it apply? Because, for example, songs came to my mind, poems, also pretense. Like, is pretending something fictional? Like, is that a fiction? It seems like it meets your definition in some sense, um, but I don't. But
hmm
I wasn't sure, like how do we constrain this definition of fiction, or if it even really matters. I mean, I'm not really an expert on this literature, so maybe it's already been dealt with. I just was curious about how we're supposed to
Yeah.
take this.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's a good question. I think there's interesting stuff in it, and I think people have wrangled a bit over, definitions of what makes a fiction, and some seeing, it's not, we're not going to be able to do it, we're not going to, be able to give that account.
Hmm.
I do think you're right. Like you can talk about what's true in the pretense,
Hmm.
and I think that does seem to me to get a really similar analysis. Um,
I know you introduced this operator thing, and maybe it's like you could give the pretense operator account of pretense, right? In the pretense, it's true that the cups are filled with tea, or so. It did seem like there was a lot of similarities between those, and I was
yeah.
just curious if you had a view about that, or if you wanted to rule it out in some way.
Um, I don't, so I don't want to rule out giving a kind of similar analysis like truth in the pretense to, because the child's saying in the pretense, instead of saying like, instead of characterizing the child as believing like you are acting like um you poured you're acting like you poured tea into the teacup. You could say something like, "Oh, in this pretense game, you poured tea in the teacup."
Hmm.
Like you could do it with an operator like that and still a belief. if I had said that though, people would say, "Oh, you got this unreduced notion of pretense in the operator, and that's you're just smuggling imagination in that way or something."
Uh-huh.
So I just like would leave it out of that. But I do think an analysis of
But you didn't do that in the fiction case because you have what like defined as a fiction is like a set of sentences
right.
that are not to be taken to be true or something like that. So then you can introduce the operator in that way. Um,
Yeah, that's right. And then I said, okay, well, I guess it's important that the notion of fiction, for its definition, doesn't need imagination for my project
mhm,
to say what it is to be a fiction. So then I tried to say, well, it's a set of sentences put forward, you're not going to believe it all and stuff. Um, I have been pushed on it about like, yeah, but isn't it problematic to have the notion of fiction in the operator? And does that make it somehow circular? I don't think it does. I mean, unless there's some reason to think that you just can't define fiction without mentioning imagination. I mean,
right.
I think what, I was trying to analyze what it is to be, um, what happens cognitively, right, when we're imagining what goes on in a fiction. I say a lot of it's just like judging that in the fiction thus and such has happened, thus and such. And and then if you want to say, well, but what is a fiction? I mean, that's a fair question. On the one hand, we all have a pretty, we have an everyday grasp of it. Like I can point out the works of fiction, right, and
Right.
distinguish them from non-fictions, and so can you. And there's no deep puzzlement about what the works of fiction are. So, um, but then if you want like a formal analysis of it, that'll be a project, and then we'll see if we could do it. Unless there's some special reason to think that that's going to require you to invoke imagination, then it's not really a problem. At least as far as I can see right at the moment.
Yeah. No, I didn't mean it
For
as an
me.
objection. I was just
Yeah, yeah.
when I read what you
But
did define it as, it seemed to me to apply quite generally.
yeah. I mean, one thing that would in this territory there's like a question, something that I don't even know what to say about is like, okay, I talked about fiction, like, or some of these other like Jack and Diane, you can imagine situations where like the imagining we do in response to it is judging that in the fiction, blah, 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 in the fiction, Jack and Diane, blah, blah, blah. Okay. But what about when we're responding to other kinds of artworks, like just, you know, um, instrumental music, you know?
Yeah.
Uh, are we imagining in response to that? Or, when we respond to artworks that are just visual or abstract artworks or really abstract avant-garde poetry or whatever, are do we even need to say that we're imagining enjoying those involves the imagination? And if we do, what is that imagination?
Yeah.
It's not judging that according to this is happening and this is
Well, I
happening.
wasn't sure. That's actually something I wanted to ask you about because
Okay.
in some cases, it does seem to me sort of to be the case that that's what is intended. For example, there's a very famous classical piece called Carnival of Animals. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but yeah,
Mm-mm.
it's a nice piece. And the composer tries to give you a sequence of these movements which are to evoke certain animals. So there's one for penguins, and there's one for like underwater aquarium, and there's one for giraffes or whatever on the plains. And I was playing this game with my son where I was like, "Here, listen to this. Now, each one of these is supposed to be an animal. Guess which one it is." And he got several of them right. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Not a lot of them, but a few of them. He was able to say, "Oh, this is penguins." And it did seem to me sort of like the composer wanted you to judge in that case that this was like evocative of the penguin, like the way they walk or the waddling sounds they make or the slithering of the snake. And
Hmm.
I wondered like if a lot of these, especially when you're thinking about scores for movies and these other kinds of things that there's an intention of the composer to get you to make a certain like, oh, this is the chase scene music. This is when they're running away. This is when you should be
Yeah,
afraid,
right.
which heightens the emotional aspect. So, yeah, I was wondering, like, are those meeting the definition in some sense? Like, it's not true. You wouldn't say it's true in that piece that there's a penguin, but you would say, oh, yeah, it's the composer wanted me to make the judgment. This sounds like penguins.
Yeah. Um,
In which case, it's imagination on your view.
I don't know. I mean, yeah, if if it's just if that's the only the only judgment I'm supposed to make, like, oh, this is similar to penguins walking, or this is evocative of penguins, or
Hmm.
um, you know, why would that count for me or anybody as imagination? Is it just because of the context? Well, you're responding to an artwork, and when people respond to art, we say that they're imagining, you know, like is um or was, then the question, the difficult question is like, was there something else going on there cognitively that wasn't just oh, that reminds me of penguins.
Hmm.
The imagining that led to that judgment, you know, I can imagine penguins not making that sound, but I whatever, it's an interesting thing. Like, imagine penguins, and that just reminds me of penguins. Um, I mean, I guess I could see giving an account of,
Yeah. I mean, we
why
often do
does it?
use terms like soundscape when we describe certain instrumental
Yeah,
music, which even in visual artwork, I would say, like, certain paintings are painted with the intention that this is a person crawling towards, the barn in the distance or whatever. So, um, yeah, I don't know. Anyway, so it's not meant as an objection. It's just, again, kind of my quest to understand, like, what is a fiction, and the way you defined it, like, are these things fictional? Like, is this song a fiction? Is that instrumental piece of fiction? It
yeah,
sounds like you want to say no, but I would just kind of thinking why
yeah,
according
yeah.
to.
You're right. No, the way I spelled it out, um, I didn't in any clear way, keep those things out.
Mhm.
I think in the in the book, I was just concerned with like treating this central case of like responding to literary fiction and the psychology of that and so on.
Yeah,
And then yeah, so when you mention these other cases, and I'm not sure I want to think about them more, but I think like, well, what are the differences in our psychology when we respond to these other things? How similar are they to responding to a fiction? How different are they? And so that would be my sort of leaping in point to then thinking about, what do we say about imagining in each case? I do in the fiction stuff talk about, responding emotionally to, I mean, emotional responses are a big part of what we're interested in responses to artworks.
right.
Um, if you just hear a beautiful, you know, um, classical piece or something and you're moved by it, I honestly don't know what people's thoughts are. Are you imagining necessarily, or are you just like, I'm just moved by it. It's just beautiful and there's no need for imagination. Like I don't even know what people would be inclined just on a first pass to say about that.
Mm.
Um, and it's that kind of experience that is like, well, that's an interesting thing to theorize about. I don't even know if a theory of imagination should try to apply itself to that.
Right.
It could be, a theory of aesthetic experience, I guess, in aesthetics, and then that's maybe what it would be.
Yeah, yeah, it would be an interesting view if you had, like, yeah, these do involve imagination, but you're right, it's not a canonical case of imagination, by far.
Yeah.
Also, I wanted to ask about possible worlds in this context, whether you think they're fictions.
Uh, are they fictions? Well, see, I would need a better definition of fiction before I could answer that well, but
Well, by your
I don't
definition
think of them.
that you gave in the book.
I don't think they're um yeah, I mean, so I guess I don't think they're concrete, you know. So what are they? Um they're kind of I don't have any well worked out view on this, but I tend to think of them as just these sort of heuristics we use that kind of as a way of summarizing our modal, intuitions about things. I don't, um,
But like when we describe twin Earth or something like that, it certainly seems like we have a
oh,
set of sentences that we don't take of as true and that we don't think of as true. And
oh, okay. So like a thought experiment.
yeah,
So
no,
I
I
thought
wasn't
you,
asking like a metaphysical question about like
oh,
David
okay.
Lewis style
Yeah,
possible
okay.
worlds.
But like what goes on when we're dealing with possible worlds,
Yeah,
like
exactly.
in the context of a thought experiment.
Yeah, because it
Um,
did seem to me like it met the definition of fiction in your sense.
yeah, I guess, if you tell the fiction, well, and you try to think about like, well, what else would be true in a world where these things that are stated are the case. Because that's sort of fits with my understanding of what's going on in fiction. To imagine the world is to, to fill out the world. You're told certain things explicitly about it by whatever person's presenting the possible world in the thought experiment. And then you sort of, based on, then you consider like, well, what else would be true in the closest possible world where this is told as known fact?
Mhm.
Like there really is this twin or, whatever. Um, and then you're just trying to fill it out. Like what else has to be true given given my prior beliefs about all this kind of stuff.
Right.
Um,
And
and
and by
so,
the way, I know all of this is tangential to the things you care about in the book. So it was just my
yeah,
idle curiosity. I'm not trying to, weigh down
yeah,
your view or
yeah.
anything.
No, I mean, that's fine. I mean, yeah, I don't know if I'm treading into saying something that seems ridiculous, but I mean, I think the way that, you fill out that world is totally dependent on, your beliefs about the nature of the actual world, because that's what you use to sort of fill it out. You kind of locate that world, you try to keep that world as close to this one as possible, and then you fill out everything um, in it as best you can. And that may alert sometimes, if it's an interestingly crafted, thought experiment like the twin Earth thing or like a Gettier case, it might alert you to the fact that, oh, I had some kind of confusions in my background beliefs that weren't entirely consistent before, and you've sort of brought those to light by making me focus on this
Right.
case about what I would say about it. But I don't think, that's not like, again, to going back to what we earlier said, that's not like some distinct source of evidence I've not conceivability evidence or something like that I've
Mhm.
accessed. You've just led me to, you've pointed to a dark spot in my background belief set, kind of, and you sort of triggered awareness of it through forcing me to consider what I would say about, what else is true in this world that you just described.
So would you say
Uh,
there is something which is true in those worlds in the same way you would say there's truth in a fictional world?
well, yeah, I guess so. With the proviso that the author gets to the author can always, change what's true, right?
Yeah.
Very easily, right? So you have to follow their lead, you know. But if it's a good thought experiment, they don't want to beg the question with the way what they explicitly say, right? They don't want
Mhm.
to just beg the question. They want to describe it and you say, and then have you fill out their world. It's like, yeah, in in that possible world, this thus and such would be true. And then furthermore, that possible world is not materially different than the actual world, I guess, for our purposes, you know.
Mhm.
So the possible world where, you know, the Gettier case comes true doesn't matter, you know, is not there's nothing exceptional about it. That doesn't mean it could that means it couldn't come true in the actual world. Like it's not like, you know, physics doesn't apply, you know, no, it's like you can imagine it happening here. And if you're inclined to judge that it's true in the fiction that Jones or whoever doesn't know the P, then you're inclined to judge that those things aren't sufficient for knowledge in the actual world. Um, but, you know, conceiving of the situation was really just like, hey, are you sure that, you know, any case of true justified belief is knowledge? Like, what if this happens, this happens, this happens? Oh, well, that's a coincidence. Then he just coincidentally has true belief. Oh, so you don't think all cases of coincidentally having a true justified belief are knowledge? No. Oh, well, then that doesn't, then you had a kind of, you didn't realize you had a kind of conflicting background beliefs. Like, you believed that you couldn't, if you coincidentally had, you know, if your belief was sort of coincidentally true, it couldn't be knowledge, but you also believed that true justified belief is always knowledge, and you just didn't realize that those could conflict until I told this story. Um, so, you know, that's the role of the story is, yeah, is leading you to fill it in based on what you already believe um, is true about the actual world.
Right. I'm aware, I have a million things I want to ask you about these last chapters of your book, but I'm aware that we're approaching our limit here. But I'm just
Sure.
curious about one thing I'll ask, which is about in fiction, do you allow that there could be partial truths or incomplete truths? So could it be the case that it's kind of indeterminately the case whether something occurred or not occurred? So I'm thinking of, fictional stories like Pan's Labyrinth, I think is a good one, where sort of at the end of the story you're left wondering, okay, was that guy real or was this all a dream? Or and so if it's not determinate in the story, then is it like a part of your account that that's okay, that it's kind of indeterminately true, or is it always going to be one or the other?
Um, I think no, I think it can be. I think there can be things that are left indeterminate. You know, what I want to capture is like the experience of the reader, the psychology of enjoying it. So the question is like, what goes on psychologically when you can't judge that in the fiction P or in the fiction not P?
Hmm.
Um, and sometimes it's an important part, as you're mentioning, of the fiction that it's supposed to be indeterminate, you know, and that appreciating that is part of appreciating the fiction, you know, properly.
Hmm.
Um, and I think, you know, it's open to me, and I'd be inclined to say that, you know, in those cases, well, you infer that, you know, in the fiction, it's indeterminate whether P, right? And and you know, if you're sophisticated enough about it, you know, and the author wants me to appreciate that, and it's an important feature of this. You know, you can have like a metafictional thought at a certain point, you know, like, oh, it's actually an important feature of this work that's left indeterminate. Like, and that's part of the imagine, like, you know, I'm enjoying this. I'm like, oh yeah, you know, there's a nearby possible world where this is true, P is true. There's also a nearby possible world where, you know, it's told as known fact that not P is true. Um, you know, there's, I think even on Lewis's picture, he always had like a range of like, you know, worlds are kind of where, you know, it could be true or not true. So it's kind of like it's just indeterminate whether it's true in the fiction, because these are equally similar worlds or something. So you could try to do that. But you know, I'm inclined to think what was going on there when you just you know, so there's sort of like the meaningless things like it's indeterminate the precise color of Holmes's underwear. You know what I mean? Like, it's neither true nor not true that they're white, you know, like, or whatever. So that's less interesting than the kind of case where uh the author purposefully, like it's some important part of aspect of the fiction that's sort of purposefully made indeterminate. And
Right.
the proper appreciation of fiction requires you to recognize that. And for those, I'd say, yeah, something like you have a kind of a metafictional thought, like, oh, this was crafted so that that's purposely left indeterminate. And I think that fits, I believe that it's indeterminate, and you know what I mean, and purposely so, in the
In
fiction.
violation of the law of the excluded middle, because I get the feeling like people like Lewis didn't want that to be true in the fiction, but you, so in fictional cases there could be, you know, things which are neither true nor false.
Well, I think, unless I misremember, I thought he would say, like with the Holmes's color of Holmes's underwear, like it's not like it's neither true nor false that his underwear was white.
Mhm.
Is that, and why
But,
is
but
that? Well, because there's a world that's, the world where it's told as known fact and his underwear is white is equally close, or, to the world where it's told as known fact and it's brown.
right, but that's different than there being a world where the underwear is neither,
Oh,
no,
okay.
where it's literally not true nor false in that world that it has a certain color.
Okay. Um, can you not just sort of add on, like it's true in the fiction, blah, blah, blah. What's true in the fiction is what's true at the world, closest world where it's told as known fact. And then that just captures what's true. It doesn't say so that doesn't capture, and then if something's indeterminate, in the fiction, you could say why it's indeterminate,
Mhm.
because of this fact about the closeness of the worlds.
No, just
Am
curious
I?
about your view. If you were comfortable with this idea that there could be like in the fiction things which were neither true nor false, or if you want to precify it in the way kind of I thought Lewis would, where no, there's just a range of worlds. We don't know which one, but in each one there's like a fact um, about which thing this is, like whether Pan's Labyrinth involves an actual supernatural occurrence or something more mundane like a dream. Or David Lynch films, like does he fall asleep on the plane at the beginning of Mulholland Drive, or is there a fact of the matter? And you might think, no, in the fiction there's no fact of the matter. It's left open.
Yeah, I guess wanted to leave it open, and then just analyze the things that aren't left open in
Hmm.
terms of this idea of worlds where things are told as known fact and what's
Okay.
true, but as far as the fictional world is not to be identified with a possible world, one of those possible worlds.
Hmm.
That makes sense. It's like there's the world of the fiction, and then you can sort of engage in this like game about thinking about possible worlds, is trying to tease out what's true in that world of the world of the fiction. But the world of the fiction is not itself some possible world. I guess that's how I'm inclined to think of it. But
Okay. And you go the
yeah,
same way for contradictions in the fiction?
um,
And I'm thinking in particular of, Grand Priest's famous, what's he call it, Sophie's Box or something. He wrote a short story where there's like a contradiction about something being in the box and then not in the box at the same time in the story. And it's kind of on purpose that he did that.
yeah, I don't know. So I guess what's true in the fiction is like, well, okay, so there's, imagining in response to the fiction is just like judging that in the fiction, thus and such. And if certain things are explicitly stated in the fiction, then um then you say, well, okay, you don't need a clever fiction. You could just say, as a fiction that says Bob went to the store. No, he didn't. Okay. Um, according to the fiction, Bob went to the, store, but no, he didn't. And also didn't go to the store. And you could say, well, that's that's what's um that's what's true in the fiction. Um, I guess that's kind of like the author said it, okay, you get to say, you know, um,
Because I think part of Graham's idea is to push back against the Quinian claim that we can't like really imagine contradictions or entertain them, or we can't interpret other people as believing contradictions. And
well,
in the
that this
story,
is
is kind
yeah.
of explicitly told in a way that you have to imagine the person in the story as holding this contradictory belief, because in the story, it is literally true and also not true that the thing is in the box. He doesn't come out and literally say this is true and also false. But if you pay careful attention to the story, the only inference that you can draw is that it is true and also not true that this certain thing is in the box.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, so I haven't read the story. I think there are cases similar to that that I've considered, like in the context of imaginative resistance. Tamar Gendler wanted to say, hey, there's this phenomenon of imaginative resistance, and it's not to be explained in terms of, well, it says something that's impossible and we can't imagine impossibilities. Because here I'm going to tell you a story where something impossible happens,
Mhm.
and you'll be able to imagine it, and then hers involves like a mathematical impossibility or something. Now, okay, so I think I see better where you're going with it now, but um, I do think like our ability when we're trying to engage with something, we're trying to understand, the fictional world, imagining will be driven by, you know, um, trying to draw out what else is true at that world. And if there's a contradiction, that'll kind of stop you. That might stop you in your tracks. Um, and I guess I think it does sometimes cause resistance when people, if someone tells a story, like literally like, Bob went to the store but actually he didn't, you do stop. You're like, well, now I'm just kind of confused,
Yeah.
like, what are you talking about? And that's, you can call that imaginative resistance, but you're really just kind of like, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to play along here. Like, what's
Mhm.
going on? Maybe if you keep talking, I'll get it, then I'll be able to fill out a world. Um, but if you just leave me with that contradiction flat out, I'm sort of like I'm not sure what else is true or how to fill out this world because you just really kind of made it impossible for me to do it. I think probably with the Grand Priest example and others like maybe time travel movies and things, they
Mhm.
might involve impossibilities, right? Probably do. It's often something like imagining is elicited by kind of hiding the contradiction,
Right.
burying it, right? And so it's always open to the person like, well, I didn't, I was following along and imagining, drawing things out in the possible world, filling that out, and then I kind of did that over here too, and you kind of hid this part where, they can't all be true together, but then again, I wasn't really keeping everything in mind together,
Mhm.
like, um, and if I did, when you really point out that impossibility, then I do feel some kind of resistance, but
Mm.
it, it and then I get confused, like, but like, take like an Avengers movie, like there's all kind of incoherent time travel going on. And some of that stuff where if you focus, they're like, what the? But you can also just not, like so. If um, I guess I do think that in a lot of these cases, I am inclined to think that like contradictions generate difficulty imagining, but you can circumvent that by sort of hiding the contradiction or
And
imagining people.
sorry to interrupt you, but when you say you hide it, then are you saying that the person doesn't really imagine the contradiction?
Yeah, kind of like yeah, exactly, like yeah, I guess I'd be happy enough saying that, like I did a heck of a lot of imagining in response to this story that's involves contradictions, right? But I didn't actually imagine the contradiction, you know. That seems fair to me, you know,
Okay.
to say.
So
Like, I
you're
don't
more
know.
so you're more open to the idea that there's indeterminacy in the fiction than there's like that we could imagine the indeterminacy in the fiction than we can the contradiction in the fiction.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, um, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I hadn't, put it that way before. So I mean, I'm just thinking about it now, but um, there's it's be weird to think like a story has to be completely filled out in some metaphysical sense.
Right.
Like clearly there's got to be things, well, clearly it just, you know, could again, like I guess I'm okay with it being true in the fiction that there's a contradiction just because I think, well, the author gets to say what's true in the fiction. That's okay. It's just I guess I'm less happy imagining contradictions than I am. I don't know what is it to imagine an indeterminacy. It's kind of like to just believe that, there's no prescribed way you're supposed to think of it as going on
Hmm.
with respect to that feature. You're not prescribed to believe it's one way or the other.
But like the
Um,
case of Graham is interesting because he wrote the story with the intention that you end up imagining something contradictory. Like that's kind of
yeah,
his whole point in writing the story. So he's
right.
definitely prescribing that you imagine that it is and isn't this way. Um, so
Well,
that's
is
why I
it?
think that's a more interesting. I mean, not a more interesting, but that's an interesting case because there's no
It
doubt
is.
about what the intention of the author is in that case.
Right. And then,
It's not like an accident where they fucked up, and like in the Marvel case where they just don't understand like time travel or something. You
yeah,
know?
yeah, right, right. Yeah, I mean, so in that case, it could be again, but there's a difference between like imagining P and then like, 5 minutes later, imagining that not P, between that and imagining that P and not P. Um, so so I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what hangs that, like, yeah, when are we going to say that, well, you didn't imagine a contradiction, you just imagined something at one point, and then you imagined something contradictory later, but you didn't imagine them at the same time. Oh no, like, or does making sense, I have to read a story, like, does making sense of the story sort of require you to keep both in mind,
Yeah,
all
yeah.
the time? And to the extent that it does, then yeah, I grant, then you are in this interesting space of like, yeah, imagining a contradiction. Um, and I don't know. I wasn't inclined to rest a lot on the issue, other than just to say I was trying to give an account of what causes imaginative resistance, those cases where we pause and say, I'm not following you with that. I don't feel like I'm imagining that.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Because there is some sort of phenomenon there, where certain things elicit that response where it's like, yeah, ordinarily you tell me what to imagine, I just imagine it, right? But then you said that, and I'm like, I don't even know what to do with that. Um, I think it is nice to say it's something about impossibility tends to like stop us in our tracks. Um, but I think, a lot of things could stop us in our tracks, like, if you're like telling a story, it's a regular novel about a couple, and you're going on for a few chapters, then there's a sentence, and they are caterpillars, and then the story continues on the rest, and you're just kind of like,
What?
Uh, that's not impossible, I guess. But is it? I don't. No, I don't. I'm experiencing resistance. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
like what's is it? Is this a deep psychological? I mean, you just kind of confused me. Like because there is. I did say, what I talk about. There's this like, reading and I guess a lot of enjoying artwork, but it is interactive. Like you're bringing something to the table. You're filling things in, you
Hmm.
know. That's
Yeah.
part of the enjoyment. Maybe even more honestly in fiction than in watching a movie where it's just like given to you more, you know, depending on the film, you know.
Yeah.
But like you know, but so there's this interactive aspect, and you know, one way of thinking about that aspect is you're kind of filling in this your most nearby possible world where it's told us known fact, and then suddenly they throw in something like, and they're caterpillars. You're like, well, hold on, I was located this world right about here, you know.
Yeah.
Now we're off over here somewhere, and I don't know what else is true in this world, you know. And now you've really thrown me for a loop. Um, and I'm not sure what else to assume, and my whole interactive component of this is kind of thrown into a jumble. And so I don't
So,
know that, you know, throw in a contradiction that is psychologically a lot different than that. Like
mm,
maybe you can make sense of it for me. Tell me how to follow along. Like maybe Grand Priest can do it.
mm,
And then I'll say, okay, I guess I see what you mean. You know, how I'm supposed to imagine in response to this impossibility. But usually, if you stick an impossibility there, I'm just going to be, you're gonna jar me out of my, you know, sort of
okay.
flow,
So
kind
it's
of
not that
following.
there's some like deep psychological fact about humans that they resist
Yeah,
contradictions or something.
yeah,
It's just like it's sort of surprising. I wasn't expecting that.
I think so. You know, but you know, yeah, it just gets, you know, it takes it back to the picture. You know, it's hard to avoid these kind of foundational things. Well, what did we mean in calling it impossible anyway? And you know, as opposed to just really weird. And so I'm not sure, you know, that I have a that you know my metaphysics, you know, that I have a satisfying metaphysics to fit match up with the psychology.
Mhm.
But I'm trying, you know, to the extent that I've been focused on the psychology, I don't feel a need to like say, hey, the mind works this way, you know. It can't conceive of an contradiction. You know, I don't know, you know.
Okay.
Think we can try to make do with them, but it'll be hard, you know. It'll have to be but yeah, but you know, it's interesting questions. They're just not things I focused on a lot there, but I've been asked about those. You're knocking on some doors that other people have too in the recent years.
Cool. Okay, well, I'm aware of that we need to be wrapping this up. So at the end, I'd just like to ask if there's anything that you wanted to have come up, but hasn't come up. And that answer can be no, but I'm just wondering if there was something you were like, oh, wanted to make sure to mention this or bring this up.
Wow. Well, I mean, we covered a lot of ground. Uh, you know, there's not a burning thing. I guess I would say, you know, if I had like a concluding remark, it would be kind of echo some things that I was, you know, you mentioned at the beginning, like, oh, I would have thought there had been like these two camps in imagination work, like the kind of more, we see a kind of reductive approach as it consists of these different other things that aren't primitive versus the primitive approach, you know. And with the book explaining imagination, you know, I attempted to go this route of, you know, the non-primitive route and stake a ground there, but not really with the idea that the way I did it, well, you know, I just did the best I could, right? But what I would like hope is like other people see that general approach
Hmm.
and are like, oh, okay, I see. That's a whole different kind of approach you could take to it, and we would do it slightly differently, you know. But nevertheless, right, it's important not to just assume all these things to be kind of convinced by really kind of superficial phenomena about the way we talk sometimes that imagination must be this sort of discrete, you know, dissociable part of the mind, and to try to chip away at that. So I just, you know, I do hope that there come to be more and more camps, and I am seeing more of that, like people starting to propose, like, well, either they'll say like, well, his approach works well for this aspect of imagination, but not others, or
Hmm.
they'll say, ah, well, I'm thinking of it reductively, maybe more as like people have been saying, like looking at imagination as a kind of like a success term of a kind. Like it's imagining when you're thinking really well and in a good way, and other times it's just whatever. And you know, these are different kind of approaches of chipping away at like um this tendency that has sometimes happens in the philosophy of mind to kind of write relatively, to write stuff we say, our platitudes about the mind, like to write them too literally into the structure of how we think,
Yeah. Hmm.
without saying, some of this is a little superficial. Like we could kind of just think our way through it and have a clear resulting picture of like how to, how our own minds work, and how to create something that imagines, what we would need to do and what we wouldn't. We'll might get clearer questions if we think more critically about some of those notions. So there you go. That's my parting thought on the project, and so yeah. But really, I've really appreciated the attention to the work you've given, Richard, and this has been a great conversation and
I agree.
great
It's
question.
been a great conversation. So thank you for joining me. I really appreciate your time, and should have happened much sooner. Hopefully, will happen again, because there's still
Yeah,
tons of stuff that we haven't talked about, in not only in this book but in your other work as well, which is tremendous. So thanks again. And if you just hang out for 1 second, I'll say bye off the air. But other than
sure,
that, thanks again.
sure thing. Thank you.
All right, we are clear.